Tuesday, November 5th, 2002, began for 64-year-old Maria de la Luz Gonzalez Anaya like any other day. Around noon, someone knocked on the door of her apartment. Opening it slightly, Maria saw a white medical coat and a social worker's identification badge. A calm voice explained that she was eligible for assistance with paperwork needed to receive government-funded healthcare benefits. For an elderly woman, that money would have been very helpful. So Maria stepped aside without the slightest hesitation, allowing the person in the white coat to enter and close the door behind them. Heavy footsteps echoed through the cramped apartment, the room filled with the smell of the street and cheap tobacco. Accustomed to dealing with people from a very different social circle, Maria made a sharp remark, apparently believing that her age entitled her to say whatever she pleased. She smirked. A moment later, the smile vanished. Something in the eyes staring back at her had changed abruptly. Maria realized it too late. The first blow was swift and unexpectedly powerful. Then came a second, and another. Each landed like a hammer strike. The elderly woman did not even have time to scream. The attacker knocked her to the floor and began strangling her with bare hands. A few minutes later, the killer left the apartment, taking money and valuables. When Maria's body was discovered, neighbors were horrified to learn that the victim was a woman of such advanced age. Meanwhile, detectives began investigating what would prove to be one of a series of brutal murders about to descend upon Mexico City. Before long, reports of elderly women dying began to appear more and more frequently throughout the capital. At first, the police failed to recognize a connection between the cases. Investigators initially believed they were dealing with different offenders. However, as the number of similar crimes continued to grow, they were forced to acknowledge that a serial killer was operating in Mexico City. Admitting this was difficult for another reason. They had little experience with such investigations. Up to that point, Mexico had only seen two serial killers in its history: the Jack the Ripper copycat, Macario Alcala Canchola, and Sara Maria Aldrete Villarreal, who killed in the name of a cult leader. Nevertheless, detectives began systematically gathering information. They already knew that all the victims lived in middle-income neighborhoods. The attacks occurred during the day, and there were no signs of forced entry. In addition, the victims' necks showed no fingernail marks. To investigators, this suggested that no struggle had preceded the strangulation. Therefore, they concluded that they were dealing with a highly intelligent offender, capable of creating a false sense of security before striking. Rumors of a serial killer in Mexico soon reached journalists, who quickly dubbed the murderer La Mataviejitas, the little old lady killer. The striking nickname shocked residents even further because it emphasized the type of victims being targeted. In Mexico, as in many other countries, old age is generally treated with respect, and only a particularly depraved individual would prey on society's most vulnerable members. Even cartel members were not known for targeting elderly women. For Mexico, crimes of this nature were virtually unheard of. Mexico City avoided descending into total panic largely because it was such a vast metropolis, where countless other aspects of life continued uninterrupted. People went to work, attended movies, and dined at restaurants. They discussed economic reforms and the early stages of the long-anticipated government war on drugs. They also enjoyed lucha libre, the uniquely theatrical form of professional wrestling that traditionally draws a clear line between heroes and villains, turning matches into dramatic spectacles of good versus evil. Yet even amid all the other major headlines, the appearance of La Mataviejitas became one of the most talked about topics in Mexico City. After Maria's death, the killer did not strike again until 2003, when 7 more victims were discovered. Not all at once, of course. In the years that followed, the murderer grew even bolder and more bloodthirsty, committing at least 30 murders between 2004 and 2005. The killer displayed a distinctive modus operandi. The victims were women between the ages of 60 and 90 who lived alone. The murderer gained access to their homes under some plausible pretext, then beat and strangled them, often using items found inside the victim's own residence. Afterwards, money and valuables were stolen. However, investigators discovered that some homes were missing items of little monetary value. These were often religious objects, such as crosses or crucifixes. No witness ever reported seeing an unfamiliar vehicle at a crime scene. Therefore, investigators assumed that the killer either came to the victim's house on foot or arrived by taxi. At several crime scenes, forensic experts discovered fingerprints as well as footprints. The offender's carelessness somewhat contradicted the theory of the killer's extraordinary intelligence. Although, on the other hand, he might have been so confident in himself and in the helplessness of the investigators that he could afford to toy with the police. While detectives were organizing a hunt for the elusive maniac, a few kilometers from another crime scene, a female wrestler known as the Lady of Silence was preparing for her performance. She was there to be supported by a new friend, a taxi driver named Jose Francisco Torres Herrera. He eagerly attended her matches and often drove her home afterward. Jose was a taciturn man who smelled of tobacco, possessed a heavy gaze, and had a habit of disappearing for hours at a time before suddenly reappearing. However, his friend paid little attention to this behavior, assuming it was simply part of his work as a taxi driver. Mexico City Attorney General Bernardo Batiz grew increasingly frustrated by the lack of progress in the investigation. Enormous pressure was being placed on him, intensified by political tensions between the federal government and the leadership of Mexico City itself. As a result, the Attorney General vowed to find the killer before the end of his term. In turn, he demanded immediate and decisive action from the police, which led to the arrest of former convict Alejandro Ovando. He was taken into custody after attacking a 63-year-old woman. Although his fingerprints did not match those found at the other crime scenes, police insisted there was no possibility of error. Their explanation was that Alejandro had an accomplice, possibly his girlfriend, who earned elderly women's trust, and that she was the one who left the fingerprints. Everything about this theory appeared coherent except for one inconvenient fact. After Alejandro's arrest, the series of inhuman murders did not stop. Another body was found. The modus operandi of the new crime matched the previous attacks down to the smallest detail. Police could not blame copycats. Detectives had no choice but to reopen the investigation and release Alejandro. January 2004 began with yet another murder resembling the previous cases. This time, the victim was 75-year-old Margarita Aceves Quezada. She was found strangled with a cable the killer had discovered inside her own home. There were no signs of a struggle. However, investigators found a witness who claimed to have seen a social worker wearing a white coat, searching for residents who lived alone. This matched statements given by other witnesses that the offender had been dressed as a nurse. As a result, police detained Matilde Sanchez Gallegos, a woman who actually worked as a nurse and regularly visited patients in their homes. She was later released due to lack of evidence. In April of the same year, detectives tried again, this time arresting Araceli Vasquez Garcia. Araceli had been entering elderly women's homes while posing as a nurse in order to steal valuables. She looked almost identical to one of the composite sketches. Realizing the seriousness of her situation, Araceli admitted to committing thefts but stubbornly denied any involvement in the murders. Police, however, were not surprised. They were convinced that Araceli herself had not killed the elderly women and that she had acted together with a male accomplice. The neighbor of the latest victim, Margarita Aceves Quezada, failed to identify Araceli, but investigators remained confident they were correct and expected the killings to end. However, they continued, which meant they had arrested the wrong person. Nevertheless, Araceli was still sentenced to 42 years in prison for theft and for the murder of Margarita. Another interesting lead that briefly captured detectives' attention was not another suspect, but a painting. The Boy in the Red Waistcoat by Jean-Baptiste Greuze, not to be confused with Paul Cézanne's painting of the same name. 3 murder victims owned reproductions of the French artist's work. Investigators wondered whether there might be some hidden connection, but it turned out to be another false lead, like so many others. So were ideas such as the attacks occurring only on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, or the assumption that the murders taking place during the day rather than evening held some special significance. Every lead ended in a dead end. Like the rest of the city, the Lady of Silence, whose real name was Juana, followed the news closely. She understood the grief of families who had lost mothers and grandmothers. She herself had recently experienced devastating loss. Her 24-year-old son had been tragically killed by robbers. They beat the young man with baseball bats and left him to die in the street. Together with her fellow wrestlers, Juana discussed the murders of elderly women, sympathizing with the victims' families and watching police efforts fail to bring the killer to justice. Based on witness accounts, police created several composite sketches and even sculpted busts of the suspect. Images were distributed throughout the city, but even here there were complications. Some witnesses described the killer as a stocky man with coarse facial features, while others emphasized feminine traits. Since investigators believed that only a man could strangle someone with bare hands, yet all witnesses insisted the offender wore female nurse's clothing, police decided to approach the case from a different angle. They concluded that their investigation echoed a case previously solved by French police. The reference was to serial killer Thierry Paulin, known as the Monster of Montmartre. In the 1980s, he murdered at least 18 elderly women. Like Mexico's little old lady killer, Paulin had no sexual motive, as he was not interested in women of any age. Instead, he used illicit substances which required money to sustain his addiction. And like La Mataviejitas, he disguised himself as a nurse. He died in prison before trial due to illness. This high-profile French case led detectives in Mexico City to consider that the nurse described by witnesses might in fact be a man in disguise. They launched a sweeping raid, detaining between 80 and 100 transgender individuals, most of whom worked in sex work. Many were immediately released after their fingerprints were compared to those found at several crime scenes. Meanwhile, Juana was struck by a new personal crisis. During a wrestling match, she suffered a serious back injury. Doctors strictly forbade her from continuing to compete. For her, it was a devastating blow. Wrestling had been her main source of income, and without it, she and her children risked losing everything. Fortunately, her friend the taxi driver Jose Herrera was still nearby. Juana could never fully figure him out. Compared to her quiet, shy nature, Jose was secretive and quick-tempered. Yet despite this, Juana felt that they might still have a future together. In September 2005, police came under unprecedented pressure following the murder of 82-year-old Carmen Camila González Miguel. She had been beaten, strangled, and robbed, hallmarks of the little old lady killer. What the attacker likely did not know, or did not care about, was that Carmen was the mother of Luis Rafael Moreno González, a prominent Mexican physician and one of the pioneers of modern forensic medicine and criminology in Latin America. Luis González began applying intense pressure on the police to finally capture the killer and protect the most vulnerable members of society. This led authorities to launch a large-scale operation called Parks and Gardens, patrolling neighborhoods where the crimes had occurred in hopes of catching the offender in the act. There were even rumors that police paid middle-aged women, or those slightly older, to sit alone on park benches in dark areas, essentially using them as bait. These rumors reached 47-year-old Juana Barraza. Her forced retirement from wrestling had immediately affected her finances. Money was running out, and she had children to support. She sold popcorn outside lucha libre arenas and took on any odd job she could find. The idea of being paid simply to sit on a bench would have been tempting. As for her friend Jose Herrera, he once again disappeared for a time, only to reappear with fresh bruises on his knuckles, which he explained as the result of fights with drunk customers. Meanwhile, the little old lady killer continued to strike. Women in Mexico City lived in fear. Families pleaded with mothers and grandmothers not to open their doors to strangers, but many elderly women lived alone and genuinely needed help. Buying groceries, obtaining medication, handling paperwork for social benefits, or simply traveling across the city. And when someone in uniform appeared at the door offering assistance, free transport, or help with documents, how could they refuse? That is how Maria Hernandez. She was found strangled with her own scarf in October 2005. After this, no further murders were recorded in 2005. It was the longest period without victims since the beginning of the killing spree. Police had no explanation. They began to suspect that the strangler might be dead, and that his final victim may have been himself. For investigators, it would have been a convenient ending, but they needed proof. In desperation, police reached an almost absurd point. Officers began comparing fingerprints from corpses in morgues with the prints they already had on file, because they still had no idea who the killer was. Meanwhile, Juana seemed to be getting back on her feet. She received permission to work as a promoter for other wrestlers, allowing her to remain in the world of lucha libre even after her injury. In 2006, she appeared on the Azteca television channel, speaking about her wrestling persona. When asked whether she considered herself a hero or a villain, referring to the traditional wrestling division between good and evil characters, Juana replied that she was a villain to the core. Yet looking at her gentle smile, it was hard to believe it. A dramatic turning point in the investigation came on January 25, 2006, when the killer noticed Ana Maria de los Reyes Alfaro and asked the woman for a glass of water. Ana did not refuse. She invited the stranger inside, but said something that enraged him. The attacker strangled her with a stethoscope, leaving her lifeless on the floor before looting the apartment. He expected, as always, to disappear into the city's crowd. But the killer did not know that Ana had a lodger, a young man named Joel Lopez, who rented a room in her house. And he was more than just a tenant. He was Ana's close friend. That day, Joel had been delayed at work. As he was returning home, he was suddenly struck by a dark sense of foreboding. When he entered the house, he found Ana's lifeless body on the floor. Then he heard a sound. Turning around, he saw a large figure in a red coat quickly leaving the house. Joel ran outside, shouting for neighbors to help stop the attacker. Fortunately, the area was being patrolled by police, and neighbors managed to alert one of the patrol units. After a short chase, they apprehended the suspect. The person in the red coat was 48-year-old Juana Barraza, a model housewife and mother of 6, who by day killed elderly women and by night dominated her opponents in the lucha libre ring under the persona of the Lady of Silence. After her arrest, police searched Juana and her home. They were left with no doubt that she was the serial killer they had been hunting. In her possession, they found a stethoscope, documents used to obtain medical benefits, and a social worker's identification card. Inside her home, investigators discovered newspaper clippings about the little old lady killer, as well as inexpensive trinkets belonging to some of her victims. Most importantly, her fingerprints matched those found at 10 different crime scenes. Police were ashamed that they had spent years searching for a man. Yet a man had still been involved in the case. The same taxi driver, Jose Herrera, had participated in several attacks and helped Juana sell stolen goods on the black market. But what could drive a woman, a mother, someone respected by colleagues and regarded as quiet and polite, to commit such crimes? To answer that, one must look into Juana's past. Juana was born on December 27, 1957, in Epazoyucan, Hidalgo, a small, picturesque municipality near Mexico City. She was born into the family of police officer Trinidad Barraza and his wife Justa Samperio. The exact details of Juana's childhood vary depending on who tells the story. But according to Juana herself, her mother left her father shortly after her birth, and she never saw him again. Soon after, a new man entered her mother's life and effectively became Juana's father figure. He raised her from the age of 3 months, and she grew up calling him Dad. Unfortunately, as in many such stories, Juana's home life was far from happy, but not because of her stepfather. It was her mother. Justa did not love her daughter. She often lamented that Juana should never have been born at all. For any misbehavior, real or imagined, Justa punished her harshly. Juana only ate when her stepfather was at home. Otherwise, her mother would at best offer her chayote or a Mexican cucumber with salt, and if the girl complained to her stepfather, her mother would beat her. On one occasion, Justa attacked her with a knife. Juana raised her arm to block the blow, and the blade pierced her flesh, leaving a scar she still carried later in life. Some sources claim her mother also restricted her education, forbidding her from attending school on the belief that a girl did not need schooling to become a housewife. Juana herself, however, recalls that it was her stepfather who opposed her education. In any case, the lack of schooling would affect her throughout her entire life. But if the girl's life had been difficult before, a living hell began when she turned 11. Among other things, Justa was an alcoholic. One day, heading out for a drink, she took her daughter with her. At the bar, the woman met her 26-year-old friend, Jose Lugo. Jose and Justa drank until the woman ran out of money. But as an alcoholic, she couldn't stop and offered Jose Lugo a deal. In exchange for 3 bottles of the cheapest beer, he could do whatever he wanted with her daughter. Jose Lugo accepted this monstrous proposal. He took Juana to his place, where he tied her wrists, brutally beat her, and abused her. This led to Juana's first pregnancy, which ended in a miscarriage. But the horror did not end with just that one time. With the mother's consent, Jose virtually kidnapped the girl. It is not known exactly how long Juana lived with this monster, as sources cite different figures, ranging from 3 months to 4 years. Most likely it was much longer than 3 months, because while in captivity, Juana gave birth to a son. And the entire time she lived with Jose, he tormented her. He did so himself, and also invited his friends, using Juana as a toy for cruel, intimate games. Of course, Juana's stepfather and other relatives who loved the girl wondered where she was, but her mother, Justa, would say that Juana had run away with some boy. The stepfather was baffled. How could she have run away with a boy if her mother didn't even allow her to go outside? He searched for her, but no one except Justa knew that Juana was being held captive by Jose Lugo. Finally, Justa's brother was lucky enough to find his niece. A neighbor of Jose Lugo told him that the girl he was looking for might be in Jose's house because the neighbors heard her screams every night and heard her calling for her father while Jose Lugo beat her. The uncle went to the house and managed to quietly call out to Juana. He wanted to help her escape, and Juana was already ready to climb out of the window and over the fence when she remembered her child. The uncle was shocked to learn that his 12-year-old niece already had a child. Nevertheless, after finding Juana, the family managed to take both the girl and the baby away from Jose Lugo. They brought her home, but it was already too late for Juana's emotional stability. The abuse from both her mother and Jose Lugo had changed her. She behaved modestly, politely, and quietly around other people, but her heart had grown hardened. The stepfather did what he could to prevent further abuse of Juana by her mother, but the relationship between mother and daughter remained cold until Justa's death in 1976 from liver cirrhosis. When the girl was brought back to the family, her stepfather told Juana that she now needed to take care of her child. So he set up a small stall next to the one where he himself worked and placed a crib there so Juana could earn money. And that's what they did. It was through this workplace that Juana soon met her first husband, but he turned out to be no better than her mother. He beat her, insulted her, and brought other women into their home. Juana divorced him and, over the next 10 years, tried several more times to build a personal life. She did not always choose the most decent partners. Often these were men connected to Mexico City's underworld, involved in drug trafficking or robbery. Nevertheless, Juana gave birth to 6 more children, became a devoted homemaker, and lived a fairly normal, modest life until her last husband disappeared. Rumors suggested it was related to a cartel. Be that as it may, Juana was left alone with her children and began looking for work. Obviously, her job prospects were limited by her lack of education. She couldn't even read or write. Fortunately, she was very good at various kinds of domestic work. She washed and ironed clothes for other families. In addition, Juana cooked very well and sold empanadas and popcorn near arenas where lucha libre wrestling shows were held. Juana had long loved wrestling and used to go watch matches despite her stepfather's prohibition, as he believed such entertainment was not suitable for girls. Ironically, one day he spotted her among the audience at a show held in a sports hall near their home. At home, he asked where she had spent the day. The stepdaughter did not deny it and admitted her love for the sport. Her stepfather said he understood why she was so drawn to wrestling, because she saw it as the only way to release the anger inside her after what her mother had done to her. At the time, young Juana didn't understand what he meant, but clearly her stepfather was right. He was a simple man, but quite intelligent and perceptive, and so, after watching other female wrestlers, Juana Barraza decided to try stepping into the ring herself. Thus was born the Silent Lady. Juana felt the nickname suited her quiet and shy nature. She chose a white and pink costume with a butterfly mask and began performing in the ring as a so-called heel villain. She worked hard, never became a superstar, but traveled with touring shows. She earned between 300 and 500 pesos, or about 40 to 80 US dollars per match. She had a good reputation among wrestlers and got along with everyone. Despite the modest income, life seemed stable until a sudden back injury. She had to leave the ring, but she remained in the industry, working as a promoter and staying on stage as the Lady of Silence, though no longer as an active wrestler. She also continued selling popcorn near arenas. Overall, Juana managed as best she could and lived honestly, without breaking the law. However, the money disappeared faster than it came in, and she had to care for a large family. Juana began to think about more desperate ways to improve her financial situation. Her criminal path started with petty theft, mostly from stores. Then she began breaking into houses. Among her acquaintances appeared people with criminal backgrounds who could help her sell stolen goods. Eventually, Juana learned about a new government program in Mexico City that provided financial and medical assistance to elderly people. And Juana's mind, constantly searching for ways to get money, saw this as an opportunity to take advantage of the most vulnerable members of society. At first, Juana had an accomplice. The women would dress as nurses and enter the homes of elderly people living alone, claiming they had come to help them. But once inside, they stole money and valuables from elderly women. However, the partnership between the thieves was short-lived. Juana's accomplice was involved with a corrupt police officer who caught the women at one of the crime scenes and began blackmailing Juana. As a result, the need for money grew even more. But even then, Juana held back and did not commit any violent attacks. The turning point came when her eldest son, Jose Enrique, died as a result of a street assault. He was beaten to death with baseball bats. Juana described this moment as the saddest of her life. According to investigators and psychiatrists, it was after her son's death that her mental state changed completely. His sudden, senseless, and brutal killing became the final trigger that pushed Juana away from society. It was then that, in a fit of rage, she strangled a victim with her bare hands and felt something she had not experienced in years: power, control, justice. She lay low for 3 months. Perhaps she was in shock over what she had done. Perhaps she was waiting for the police to come for her. But no one came. And the rage returned, stronger than before. In March 2003, she killed again. 84-year-old Guillermina Leon. But this time she used a ligature. This time she took a trophy from the home. And this time she had no doubt she would do it again, because her childhood trauma had not healed. It had transformed into something dark and sinister. Using her connections in the criminal world, she obtained a list of pensioners eligible for state assistance. Now it became easy for her to enter the homes of her intended victims. At the same time, Juana continued to live a normal life, raising her children and working in wrestling shows as a promoter. While the police were still searching for a man, Juana lived in plain sight. Her composite sketches were posted all over Mexico City, yet she still appeared on television. In 2006, she appeared on Azteca TV, talking about her wrestling persona. When asked by a journalist whether she saw herself as a villain or a hero, Juana replied that she was a villain to the core. Only a week later, when luck turned against her and police caught her at the scene of another crime, it became clear just how openly she had answered that question. She lived a double life in plain sight, without raising even the slightest suspicion. Juana Barraza stood trial, where she was charged with 11 murders and 12 robberies. A forensic psychiatrist stated that the motive was not so much money, but a deeply rooted hatred of her mother. Juana Barraza saw her victims as a way to take revenge for years of humiliation and abuse she had suffered in her mother's home. She was found guilty and sentenced to a record 759 years in prison. However, in Mexico, sentences are served concurrently. In addition, by law, no sentence can exceed 50 years. Therefore, Juana will be eligible for parole in 2058, when she will be 100 years old. She is currently 68 years old and is still serving her sentence. She works in prison as a gym instructor, and on Mondays and Wednesdays she prepares tacos for inmates who line up for them. As for her children, at the time of her arrest, only her youngest son and daughter were living with her. They moved in with their older sister. Their childhood ended the moment police came to search their home after their mother's arrest. Her son refuses to communicate with her. All of Juana's other children and grandchildren regularly visit her in prison. Understanding that she will likely never be released, Juana Barraza has taken responsibility for 4 of the murders she was charged with, but insists she is not responsible for the other atrocities. Thus ends the story of Juana Barraza, a female wrestler known as the Lady of Silence, who silenced dozens of elderly women. Although the case was closed in 2006, experts estimate that Juana may be responsible for up to 48 deaths, making her the most dangerous female serial killer in Mexico's history. Many families still do not know what happened to their mothers and grandmothers. Were they victims of Juana, or did someone imitate the serial killer knowing that La Mata Viejitas was operating in the capital? And could it all have been prevented if someone had intervened when an 11-year-old girl was sold for 3 bottles of cheap beer? The woman carefully unlocked the apartment door and stepped inside. It was dark, far too dark for the middle of the day. No lights were on. There was no television, no sound of footsteps, only a heavy, oppressive silence. Then she heard voices coming from deeper inside the apartment. A man and a woman were sitting there. Both stared straight ahead with empty, sightless eyes. A chill ran down her spine. Shortly before his death, her own son had also lost his eyesight. A coincidence? No. At that moment, she realized that behind a chain of bizarre injuries, deaths, and so-called accidents stood a single person, someone everyone trusted without question. A perfect manipulator, a perfect liar, a perfect killer. Today's story is about a kind of perfection you would never want to encounter in real life. The story of the perfect psychopath. Lim could not stop thinking about the charming woman he had met the previous evening in downtown Seoul. She was beautiful, tall, elegant, and slender, with a soft voice that seemed to soothe everyone around her. Her name was Aeom In-suk. She presented herself as a woman from a wealthy family who had received an excellent education. There was an air of confidence and dignity about her that was impossible to ignore. Lim decided he had to see her again, and he did. Before long, the two realized they did not want to be apart. They moved in together and enjoyed a luxurious lifestyle. Aeom showered both Lim and his family with expensive gifts. At one point, she surprised him with an SUV worth 30 million won, roughly $25,000 to $30,000 at the exchange rate of the time. They were genuinely happy and making plans for the future. Then, only 6 months later, Lim suddenly lost consciousness, collapsed, and fractured his tailbone. Aeom appeared devastated. She barely left his bedside at the hospital, staying with him almost constantly. Lim was deeply touched by her devotion. With such attentive care, his recovery was swift. But from that moment on, misfortune seemed to follow him everywhere. He became clumsy. He frequently fell. He suffered burns and other injuries. Each time, Aeom blamed herself for not paying closer attention and preventing him from hurting himself. Yet the accidents only became more severe. A month after his first fall, Lim woke up unable to open his eyes. His eyelids were swollen shut. Aeom rushed him to the hospital. She devoted herself to caring for him despite the fact that she was pregnant. Lim begged her to leave him and move on with her life. She refused. While he remained hospitalized, she legally registered their marriage, determined to prove that she would never abandon him. Unfortunately, on February 12, 2003, the young husband died. While his family cried beside his hospital bed, Aeom quietly slipped away. For the first time in months, she could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Her next insurance payout was on the way. In reality, Aeom's parents were hardworking and modest people. They raised their daughter and 2 sons in a household where discipline, responsibility, and diligence were expected. Her early childhood appeared completely normal. There were no warning signs, no dramatic events, nothing that suggested what she would eventually become. But as Aeom grew older, something darker began to emerge beneath her pleasant exterior. People who knew her during her teenage years later described her as demanding, self-centered, and manipulative. Years later, psychologists would identify traits associated with what is often called the dark triad: narcissism, psychopathy, and chronic manipulative behavior. Combined, these traits can create the psychological profile of someone capable of extraordinary cruelty. Unlike the values her parents tried to instill in her, Aeom's ambitions were not restrained by conscience. If she wanted something, she took it. It was therefore not surprising that criminal tendencies appeared while she was still in school. One day, she secretly gave a classmate sleeping pills, stole his credit card, and went shopping. It was an early glimpse of a pattern that would later become far more sinister. As she grew older, Ayam became an exceptionally attractive young woman. She was tall and slim, with delicate features, but her most striking characteristic was her eyes. Intense, expressive, and difficult to ignore. Some people later compared her appearance to that of actress Park Shin-hye. Ayam understood the power of her beauty and used it skillfully. She could reinvent herself depending on her audience. With a few strokes of makeup, she could appear seductive and irresistible. At other times, she could project innocence and vulnerability if that image served her better. Flirting came naturally to her. Men were drawn to her beauty and captivated by her dark, magnetic eyes. She often persuaded them to buy gifts far beyond their financial means, leaving them burdened with debt while she moved on without the slightest hint of guilt. People trusted her instinctively. Her charm was the perfect disguise. After graduating from school, Ayam met a young man named Lee. Their relationship progressed quickly. Lee was captivated by her beauty, confidence, and the mysterious aura she carried. Even when she stood right beside him, she somehow seemed unattainable. Not long after they met, he proposed. Both families believed the couple was rushing into marriage, but neither Lee nor Ayam listened. They were married in April 1997. In July 1998, Ayam gave birth to their daughter. At first, everything appeared normal. M worked for an insurance company, while Lee was employed by a freight transportation company. He was not wealthy, but he was dependable and hardworking. He believed that persistence and sacrifice would eventually provide a comfortable future for his family. Ayam saw things differently. She found their modest lifestyle unbearable. Eventually, she left both her husband and infant daughter and moved back in with her parents. Soon afterward, her father died. Without consulting her mother or brothers, Ayam immediately began spending money using his credit card. The incident caused serious conflict within the family, forcing her to return to Lee and their daughter. Happy to have his wife back, Lee threw himself into work. He accepted overtime shifts, denied himself even basic comforts, and tried to earn enough to satisfy her expectations. He convinced himself that her demands were temporary. Surely things would improve. They never did. Nothing was ever enough for Ayam. Designer clothes, luxury cosmetics, dinner at the city's most expensive restaurants. If she wanted blue crab, she bought it. If she wanted an expensive handbag, she bought it without even looking at the price. 6 days a week, from 10 in the morning until 7 in the evening, she spent her time shopping or relaxing at luxury spas. Meanwhile, Lee watched his salary disappear. Not a single one was being saved for their daughter's future. When he finally tried to explain that they needed to think about their child, the conversation ended in an argument. Ayam had no interest in compromise. Instead of helping the family's finances, she quit her job at the insurance company. From that moment on, every financial burden fell on Lee's shoulders. Then, in February 2000, tragedy struck. Their 3-year-old daughter was playing near the staircase in their apartment building when she fell, struck her head, and died. Her death was ruled an accident, but it also marked the moment when Ayam's crimes took an even darker turn. Only 2 months later, she visited a psychiatrist, claiming she was struggling with disturbing thoughts. The doctor prescribed medication that, in large doses, could cause severe drowsiness, confusion, and even memory loss. Ayam had no intention of taking it herself. Instead, she purchased several insurance policies for her husband: health insurance, accident insurance, life insurance. Every policy listed her as the sole beneficiary. Years later, she admitted what she had been thinking at the time. Just imagining all the money my husband's body could earn for me made me feel good. She no longer needed medication. Lee had poor eyesight. Because of it, people already considered him clumsy and prone to falling. To Ayam, it was the perfect cover. Early in 2000, she slipped her prescription medication into one of his drinks. After he lost consciousness, she pushed him down a flight of stairs. The injuries earned her first insurance payout, $340,000 won. Roughly $246. It wasn't enough, so she continued. Whenever Lee fell asleep under the effects of the drugs, Ayam attacked him. She pushed him downstairs. She kicked him. She slammed his head against the floor. When he regained consciousness, he remembered nothing. It all felt like a terrible nightmare. but the bruises covering his body were very real. Whenever doctors asked what had happened, Ayam answered in the same calm, gentle voice. Her husband had always been somewhat clumsy. His poor eyesight made accidents inevitable. His injuries matched her explanation. The doctors believed every word. None of them knew that while Lee recovered in hospital, his wife was filing yet another insurance claim. To Ayam, her husband's body had become an ATM, but the payouts grew smaller. The excitement faded. She needed something more. In May 2000, she again drugged Lee until he lost consciousness. What happened next was so horrific that even seasoned investigators later described it as monstrous. She climbed onto the bed beside her unconscious husband, carefully lifted one eyelid, then the other. Using a long metal pin, she deliberately injured both of his eyes. When she finished, she calmly closed his eyelids and waited. Later, she described the feeling herself. When I think about the joy my husband's suffering will bring me, thrills run through my entire body. Several hours later, Lee awoke in agony. His eyelids were swollen shut. He felt as though someone had pierced his eyes. The pain became unbearable. He begged his wife to take him to the hospital. Hospital staff admired Ayam. They believed she was the picture of devotion. Whenever doctors entered the room, they saw only a loving wife caring for her blind husband. They never saw the smile that appeared on her face after everyone left. To them, it was a tragedy. To her, it was income. Over the next 2 years, Ayam collected dozens of insurance payouts from multiple companies. After Lee lost his sight completely, he became entirely dependent on her. She used that dependence against him. More falls, more beatings, head injuries, burns, bruises. On one occasion, she even poured boiling cooking oil onto his face. Every time she calmly insisted it had been another unfortunate accident. No one questioned her. From the outside, Lee simply appeared to be a blind man who constantly hurt himself. Eventually, he began believing it himself. His own mother praised Ayam endlessly, convinced her son had married an extraordinary woman. She had no idea that while Lee sat alone in complete darkness, his wife spent insurance money in Seoul's luxury boutiques, beauty salons, and exclusive nightclubs. Eventually, even Ayam realized the injuries were becoming difficult to explain. She came up with a new idea. If accidents no longer seemed believable, perhaps people would believe a suicide attempt. One night after Lee had fallen asleep, she placed a knife in his hand and stabbed him in the abdomen. Investigators later believed she intended to strike his liver and kill him. Instead, she pierced his intestines. Panicking or pretending to panic, she called emergency services. She tearfully claimed that her blind, severely depressed husband had tried to kill himself during a mental breakdown. But the plan failed. Lee survived. That only meant she would have to try again. On March 25, 2002, 27-year-old Lee finally died. In the weeks leading up to his death, he developed cellulitis, a serious bacterial infection that spreads rapidly through soft tissue and can lead to organ failure if left untreated. He came heartbreakingly close to an eerie milestone. Had he survived just 2 more attacks, Ayam would have received exactly 60 insurance payouts. Instead, she collected 58. That means Lee was assaulted, on average, every 1 or 2 weeks for nearly 2 years. By the time he died, his suffering had earned his widow approximately $230,000. At just 24 years old, Ayam was now a financially secure widow with what appeared to be her whole life ahead of her. She returned to the lifestyle she loved: shopping, luxury, and nightlife. Only a month after Lee's death, she met another man at a nightclub. His name was Lim. Unlike her first husband, Lim was a former athlete. He was healthy, physically strong, financially comfortable, and held a stable office job. Ayam never told him she had been married before. Instead, she built an entirely new identity. She claimed to come from an extremely wealthy family. She said she had received an elite education. She explained that her family spent most of their time overseas, which conveniently meant Lim would never be able to meet them. She looked the part: designer clothes, luxury handbags, expensive jewelry. She even bought Lim lavish gifts, including a brand new SUV. There was no reason for him to doubt anything she said. He believed he had met the perfect woman. The couple moved in together. At first, their life together seemed ideal. Then history began repeating itself. Lim suddenly fainted. Soon afterward, he became unusually clumsy. He suffered one accident after another. Then he unexpectedly lost his eyesight. After that came burns, more injuries, and finally, just like Lee before him, he died from cellulitis. Even after his death, Eum never abandoned her performance. She participated in a traditional Korean posthumous marriage ritual, a symbolic ceremony honoring a deceased partner. To Lim's relatives and friends, it looked like the ultimate expression of love and devotion. No one suspected they were watching a murderer. Because Eum was pregnant, Lim's family gently encouraged her to terminate the pregnancy and begin a new life while she was still young. Historically, in South Korea, raising a child alone was often viewed as an obstacle to future relationships due to social expectations and family responsibilities. Although attitudes have gradually changed, especially in cities like Seoul, those beliefs were still common at the time. Eum refused. She insisted she would keep the baby. That decision only reinforced everyone's belief that she was a devoted widow. No one imagined that everything had been planned from the beginning. Working for an insurance company had taught Eum exactly how the industry operated. She knew which claims resulted in the largest payouts. Death came first. Permanent blindness came second. Fire-related losses ranked third. She had already mastered the first two. The third was still waiting. No matter how much money Eum obtained, it disappeared almost immediately. The insurance payout from Lim's death vanished just as quickly as the previous one. She understood that a third dead husband would almost certainly attract suspicion from insurance investigators, so she turned her attention toward her own family. Using her newborn son as an excuse, she reconciled with her mother and brothers and moved back into the family home. Only weeks later, on July 26, 2003, she mixed medication into a glass of pomegranate juice and offered it to her mother, claiming it was extremely healthy. After her mother fell asleep, Eum quietly imagined what she would buy with the insurance money. She later admitted that the thought of designer handbags excited her. Then she repeated the same horrifying ritual she had performed on her husbands. This time, instead of a metal pin, she used the needle of a syringe. Her mother permanently lost sight in one eye. Once again, Eum flawlessly adopted a new role. No longer the devoted wife. Now she became the caring daughter. 4 months later, she prepared another glass of pomegranate juice. This one was for her older brother. After he lost consciousness, she decided to try something different. Instead of using a needle, she poured hydrochloric acid directly into both of his eyes. He was left permanently blind. Unlike her husbands, neither her mother nor her brother had been insured by Eum herself. Their insurance policies already existed, and they were supposed to receive the compensation personally, but they trusted her completely. They allowed her to withdraw the money on their behalf. She took every dollar she could, approximately $55,000 from her mother's insurance, and $65,000 out of her brother's $160,000 settlement. Predictably, the money did not last. Soon, Eum found herself desperate again. Her older brother remained hospitalized, blind, helpless, and entirely dependent on those around him. Eum came to visit. Something about her voice unsettled him. Perhaps losing his eyesight had sharpened his other senses. Or perhaps, deep down, he already feared the truth. As Eum approached his bed, he felt the blanket move. Then he noticed someone tugging on his intravenous line. Instinctively, he grabbed the catheter and held it tightly. At that exact moment, a nurse entered the room. She may have unknowingly saved his life. Hidden behind Eum's back was a syringe filled with a bronchodilator. Injected in the wrong circumstances, it could have triggered a fatal cardiac event. The nurse never saw it. Eum quietly left the room. She never visited her brother again. He had narrowly escaped becoming her next victim. Even then, he struggled to believe his own sister could be responsible. Instead, he convinced himself that both he and his mother must have developed some rare hereditary disease that had suddenly stolen their eyesight. I'm sure that by this point, a question has crossed your mind. 2 husbands, a mother, and a brother of Eum all went blind. Couldn't anyone connect the dots and realize that something strange was happening? No, because each incident happened separately from the others. After the death of each husband, Eum simply cut off all contact with their families, and the victims and their relatives never crossed paths. But not everyone accepted this explanation. The mother of Eom's second husband, could not understand why her daughter-in-law had completely erased them from her life. The woman desperately wanted to see her little grandson. Several months later, she tracked her daughter-in-law down to her family's apartment. She was surprised to discover that it was an ordinary apartment in an ordinary neighborhood, not the billionaire's mansion Eom had described. But her shock at that discovery was nothing compared to what she felt when she stepped inside. She was greeted by Eom's brother and mother, both of whom had suddenly lost their eyesight, just like her late son. That was when she realized it was not a simple coincidence. Her son had not died of natural causes. She rushed to the police with this information, but they simply did not believe her. By Christmas 2004, once again broke and desperate, Eom secretly sold the family apartment for $80,000. She had already spent almost all the money by the time her mother and brothers found out and asked where they were supposed to go now. They simply did not yet know that their fate had already been decided. When Eom was a child, her older and younger brothers annoyed her because she felt they were getting things that belonged to her. But now she was glad to have a large family, because they could bring in more money. She set the apartment on fire with her mother and brothers still inside, after first drugging them with pomegranate juice mixed with medication. Her older brother, who had begun to doubt his sister, did not want to accept the pomegranate juice from her hands. He said so openly, which immediately sent Eom into a rage. To calm her down, he pretended to drink the beverage. Although he only swallowed a tiny amount, it was enough to make him fall asleep. When the young man woke up, he was sitting on the sofa with a twisted, burning newspaper in his hand. Of course, he could not see, but he felt the smoke and the heat and realized that the room was on fire. Fortunately, thanks to him, everyone managed to escape. However, they suffered severe burns. Since she had burned down the only apartment where she could live, Eom needed to find someone willing to take her in. That kind soul turned out to be Mrs. Kang, a nanny who had previously worked for her. Eom asked if she could stay at her home for a few days until she and her son found new housing. The woman could not refuse to shelter a young mother with a small child in her arms. But weeks passed, then even a month, and the guest showed no sign that she planned to leave. At the same time, she had no intention of compensating the woman and her family for the inconvenience. Unable to continue supporting 2 extra people, the nanny asked Eom to move out the next day. Enraged by this request, Eom waited until nightfall, set a towel on fire, and threw it into the bedroom where the woman and her husband were sleeping. She wrapped herself and her son in wet towels and walked out of the burning apartment. As a result of the fire, the kind-hearted host and her daughter were left with lifelong burn scars, while the woman's husband died. But Eom could not simply stand by and watch the victims receive treatment in the hospital. This was the first crack in her illusion of control. In mid-April, she entered the burn unit where her former nanny and her daughter were recovering. She brought a horrifying surprise with her, a plastic bottle filled with gasoline inside a shopping bag. Consider the cruelty of it, starting a fire in a ward full of patients who had already suffered from a fire. Fortunately, the hospital had security cameras installed. The staff quickly extinguished the flames and the police arrested Eom. However, she was arrested only in connection with the hospital arson. The police knew nothing about her other crimes, so when she claimed that she needed to take care of her blind mother and brother, as well as her sick young son, the judge agreed not to keep her in custody. The charges against her were not dropped. She was simply allowed to remain free while investigators continued their work. But Eom was beyond saving, and even after this, she did not stop. She resumed contact with a woman named Yu. Yu was around 30 years old. The 2 women had met several years earlier, when Eom's first husband, Lee, was recovering in the hospital. Eom visited Yu at her home and offered her a special drink. She mixed an antidepressant with strawberries crushed in a blender. That was the last thing Yu remembered. Of course, Eom had not insured her. When the victim regained consciousness, she discovered that her credit card was missing, along with the $4,500 that had been on it. The next victim of the relentless killer was another acquaintance, a woman in her early 20s. She was the girlfriend of a patient recovering in the same hospital where Eom's young son was being treated. Eom stole her credit card as well, but fearing that the crime would eventually be discovered, she committed another one. She gave the victim an antidepressant disguised as a weight loss pill and pierced her right eye with her constant companion, a pin. The stolen money was used, among other things, to cover her son's medical expenses. Iom's 3-year-old son was diagnosed with Kawasaki syndrome, a disease that primarily affects children under 5 and causes inflammation of the blood vessels. It is usually successfully treated. However, on April 1st, 2005, the boy died. And here is what is strange. Doctors could not explain his death. The child had been recovering and was expected to be discharged when he suddenly died from cardiac arrest, which physicians believed was a complication of the illness. Until this point, Iom had only been suspected of arson, but investigators began looking at the case differently when, just days after her release, the younger brother of one of the victims walked into the police station and said something unexpected. He told detectives that terrible things kept happening to his older sister. "Everyone who enters my sister's circle of acquaintances either dies or gets injured." He urged them to stop treating these incidents as separate accidents and finally see the bigger picture. By April 19th, investigators had gathered enough evidence to arrest Iom again and formally charge her. At that time, she was dating a new man, and it seemed he had been incredibly lucky. During questioning, Iom told detectives that her actions had been caused by mental disorders and an addiction to illegal substances. But the specialist she had consulted had never diagnosed her with any disorder, and there was no trace of illegal drugs in her system. However, after she claimed that she had set the hospital fire because she wanted to see the spirit of her deceased daughter in the flames, Iom was sent for a psychiatric evaluation. During the examination, she was asked to take Robert Hare's psychopathy checklist. She scored an astonishing 40 out of 40 points. Iom Suk was a perfect psychopath. Even Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer scored lower. But while many psychopaths are capable of living among others without breaking the law, Iom seemed almost incapable of stopping herself. She was constantly overwhelmed by boredom. She needed new emotions, stronger and stronger stimulation. But the pleasure always faded quickly, forcing her to search for the next dose. For people like this, nothing is ever enough. It is like a thirst that can never be quenched. After receiving nearly $1 million by the exchange rate of that time, Iom spent the money on entertainment, expensive brands, and a luxurious lifestyle. If not for her final desperate and foolish act of arson, she would not have stopped. Iom was completely beyond rehabilitation. Even in prison, where she is serving a life sentence, she continues to complain that her clothes and toiletries are not from the brands and labels she was accustomed to. She wrote letters to the detective who handled her case, asking him to buy her various personal care products. The man joked that even his own wife did not use such expensive things. Why should he buy them for Iom? Simply because she had become accustomed to having every desire fulfilled immediately? But her current demands are only a distant echo of the lifestyle she once had, the lifestyle that pushed her toward committing crimes. Irreversible harm in exchange for temporary comfort, again and again. Even among the most terrifying serial killers, there is often a boundary between victims and family. Iom erased that boundary. Her mother, her brother, her husbands who loved her, and possibly even her 3-year-old daughter and 3-year-old son. No one was untouchable. When psychiatrists called her a perfect psychopath, they were not talking about intelligence or theatrical evil. They were describing something far worse, a person capable of causing catastrophic harm without regret, without guilt, and without showing a single emotion on her beautiful face. Seven friends got into their cars and drove to a quiet yet popular destination known as the Gapyeong River Valley. The area was famous for its beautiful waterfalls, crystal-clear pools, and towering cliffs that visitors often jumped from into the water below. That was exactly what the group had come to do. Since the drive from Seoul took about an hour, they arrived well after noon. They spent the afternoon swimming and eating fresh fruit. Eventually the sun set, evening fell, and it was time to head home. But someone suggested making one final jump from the cliff before leaving. One couple declined. They were cold and decided to wait for the others in their car at the parking lot. The remaining 5 friends stayed behind. The young men climbed to the top of the cliff and began jumping into the water one after another, while the women waited on the shore. 3 men jumped, but only 2 resurfaced. The oldest of the group, Yoon Sang-yup, never came back up. The men immediately dove in to search for him while the women threw a life ring into the water. It was all in vain. By the time rescuers arrived, they could only confirm with regret that what had begun as a wonderful day in the Gapyeong River Valley had ended in tragedy. Sometime later, 28-year-old Lee Yoon-hae, Yoon's wife, contacted SBS, one of South Korea's largest and most influential broadcasting companies. She desperately needed their help. Lee explained that her husband had died tragically in the Gapyeong River Valley. Since then, both her life and the lives of her daughter and parents had fallen apart because the insurance company had refused to pay out her husband's life insurance policy. Fighting back tears, Lee said that she and Yoon had married in 2016 after dating for 4 years. She described him as her best friend, her greatest source of support, and the rock she could always rely on. According to Lee, her parents were unable to work, and Yoon had worked tirelessly to support them as well. The young couple sent nearly all of their money to her parents. Sometimes they could not even afford a package of instant ramen from a nearby convenience store or replace their worn-out shoes. Yet they never complained, because they had each other. Yoon was also a very responsible man. From the moment they married, he made sure to pay his insurance premiums regularly. But after his death, the insurance company refused to pay his widow, claiming they suspected insurance fraud. Lee couldn't understand the accusation. How could she possibly have staged such a scheme when her husband had died after voluntarily jumping from a cliff? He had been the last to jump. No one had pushed him, and several witnesses had seen exactly what happened. The police had ruled the incident a tragic accident. So why, she asked, was the insurance company effectively leaving her family homeless? The television network sympathized with Lee. Reporters became interested in her story and decided to produce an episode exposing what they believed were the unfair practices of insurance companies, how they allegedly exploited grieving families who could not afford legal representation. The producers promised Lee they would help uncover the truth. On October 17, 2020, a new episode of the investigative television program I Want to Know aired under the title The Last Jump of the Day, The Mystery of the Death in the Gapyeong River Valley. However, instead of exposing corruption within the insurance industry, the journalists focused on the events leading up to Yoon's death and on the increasingly suspicious behavior of his wife, Lee. 7 people had traveled to the river that day, but not everyone knew each other. In fact, the one person connecting the entire group was Lee. She had come to the river with her lover, Cho Hyun-soo, her former lover, Kwon, and her husband, Yoon, whom she introduced merely as an older friend. Technically, that description wasn't false. Yoon was indeed 11 years older than Lee. He was 39 while she was 28, roughly the same age as everyone else in the group. But he wasn't simply an older friend. He was her husband. So Lee had gone on a day trip with her husband, her current lover, and her former lover. Her friends did not learn that Yoon was actually her husband until long after his death. Perhaps sensing how awkward the group's dynamics might be, Lee invited a school friend and her boyfriend to join them. Meanwhile, Kwon, Lee's ex-lover, brought along his own girlfriend, Choi, who had no idea that Lee and Kwon had once been in a relationship, or that they might even still have been seeing each other behind her back. The unusual group arrived at the waterfall around midday. Just as Lee had described, they spent hours swimming, jumping from the cliffs into the water, and eating watermelon, but not everyone seemed to be enjoying the outing. Lee and her friends repeatedly singled Yoon out for ridicule. To begin with, they had forgotten to bring a knife, or perhaps they had intentionally left it behind. The truth remains unclear. Either way, they were now faced with a problem. How were they supposed to cut open the watermelon? Most groups of close friends would probably have found a practical solution. Lee's friends came up with a very different idea. Someone should break the watermelon open with their head. 7 adults played a game of rock, paper, scissors to decide who would do it. Lee lost, but unsurprisingly, she had no intention of following through. Instead, her older friend volunteered to take her place. Cho held the watermelon while Yoon, encouraged by his wife and the others, repeatedly slammed his head into it. The entire incident was recorded on video. The footage shows Yoon stopping after each impact and clutching his head in pain. It is worth noting that the force required to crack a watermelon is surprisingly close to the limits of what the human skull can safely withstand. Beyond the risk of skull fractures, repeated impacts also place tremendous stress on the cervical spine. If the blow is not strong enough to break the watermelon, it can rebound like an elastic ball, transferring much of the impact force back into the person's head and significantly increasing the risk of serious injury. Somehow, Yoon eventually managed to crack the watermelon, but even then, he wasn't allowed to use his hands. The watermelon had to be split completely in half, so he kept hitting it with his head until the others declared the challenge complete. All of this took place while 6 adults laughed, cheered, and egged him on, and it was only the beginning. Afterward, everyone went back into the water. Yoon couldn't swim, so he planned to relax on an inflatable inner tube. Everyone in the group knew that he was unable to swim. Nevertheless, Cho and Kwon, Lee's current and former lovers, swam over to him and began pulling the tube toward the waterfall, where the water was roughly 3 meters deep. Once there, they started rocking it violently, clearly trying to flip it over. Lee watched from the shore, encouraging them. As with the watermelon incident, Yoon was obviously not enjoying himself. He repeatedly asked the men to stop and push their hands away from the tube. The women joined in as well. At one point, one of them shouted, "Shark!" frightening Yoon so badly that he covered his ears in panic. Some people might dismiss this as a group of friends fooling around and simply taking the joke too far, but this happened in South Korea, where age hierarchy and respect for elders are deeply ingrained cultural norms. Respect is expected not only toward elderly people, but also toward anyone even slightly older. Yoon was about 10 years older than everyone else in the group. Within that cultural context, treating him this way was considered especially disrespectful and completely unacceptable. Eventually, the day was drawing to a close. Night had fallen and the temperature had dropped. Lee's school friend and her boyfriend said they were cold and decided to wait in their car at the parking lot. The rest of the group also appeared ready to leave. Then Lee suggested making one last jump from the cliff. Notably, she had no intention of jumping herself. Cho and Kwon immediately supported the idea. Yoon did not. He had refused to jump earlier that day, even in broad daylight. He certainly had no desire to jump into dark water at night, especially considering that he couldn't swim. Kwon's girlfriend, Choi, also had no intention of jumping, but Lee kept pressuring Yoon. She refused to let the matter drop. Finally, she declared, "If you won't jump, then I will," as though someone absolutely pested to make the jump. But who, exactly? A group of people approaching 30 years old behaved more like cruel teenagers, relentlessly pressuring one man until he finally gave in. Yoon eventually agreed. In a group like this, he may have felt that he had little choice. At approximately 8:30 p.m., the 3 men climbed to the top of the cliff. The women remained on the shore watching, while the other couple had long since returned to their car to warm up. Cho carried the inflatable tube with him and tossed it into the water before diving headfirst. He surfaced safely. At first glance, it seemed as though he had thrown the tube into the water for Yoon to use. Instead, Cho climbed onto it himself and waited. Kwon jumped next. When he resurfaced, it was finally Yoon's turn. What happened next is known primarily from Choi's account, and her testimony differs from what the others later claimed. According to Choi, Yoon hesitated for a moment before jumping. He jumped voluntarily. No one pushed him. A few moments later, his head appeared above the surface. Although he couldn't swim, he wasn't screaming, calling for help, or panicking. Somehow he was managing to stay afloat. All 3 men were clearly visible above the water. They began slowly making their way toward the shore. Then something strange happened. Choi distinctly recalled seeing Cho make a hand gesture, as though signaling to someone. Before she had time to think about what the gesture might mean, Lee turned to her and asked for a cigarette. Choi looked away from the water for only a moment, just long enough to lean over, reach into her bag, and take out a cigarette. She suddenly heard a short, sharp cry. When she looked back, Yoon was struggling to stay afloat. He was clearly drowning. She couldn't understand what had happened. Just moments earlier, everything had seemed perfectly fine. Cho started swimming toward Yoon, but the inflatable tube around his body was obviously slowing him down. The 2 men were only about 9 meters apart. Under normal circumstances, it should have taken Cho no more than 20 seconds to cover that distance. Instead, he moved incredibly slowly. The tube seemed to leave him almost splashing in place rather than making real progress. Growing increasingly frustrated, Choi shouted at him to take the inflatable tube off. Cho finally listened. He removed it and threw it away. But instead of tossing it toward Yoon, he threw it farther away from both himself and the drowning man, even though he could easily have pushed it in Yoon's direction. At first glance, that might not seem important, since he should have reached Yoon within seconds anyway. But he continued swimming unusually slowly. To Choi, it felt as though she were watching a movie in slow motion. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. At that point, Lee suggested running to retrieve the life ring that was mounted on top of the cliff for visitors' safety. The women ran to get it, leaving them unable to see what was happening in the water. By the time they returned to the shore with the life ring, only about 2 minutes had passed. The surface of the water was perfectly still. Cho was standing near the bank, repeatedly saying, "I can't see him, I can't see him." Kwon confirmed that they had been unable to help Yoon. Choi called emergency services. Rescuers soon arrived, recovered Yoon from the water, and attempted CPR, but he could not be revived. Because Yoon had been spending the day with friends, had entered the water voluntarily, and there was no evidence that anyone had pushed him, the police concluded that his death was a tragic accident. Until Lee contacted SBS asking for help obtaining the insurance payout, no one, not even Yoon's family, had expressed any suspicions about the circumstances surrounding his death. The only exception was the insurance company. However, once SBS journalists began investigating the case, they uncovered information that came as a complete shock to Yoon's relatives. First, they learned that Yoon had apparently never even lived in the newlywed apartment he had rented several years earlier. Instead, he had been paying for an apartment where his wife lived with whichever boyfriend she happened to be dating at the time. According to the investigation, when Lee and Yoon got married, she insisted from the very beginning that they maintain 2 separate residences. Yoon worked in Suwon, about 19 miles south of Seoul. Lee, however, flatly refused to move there. She wanted to live in Incheon, a city bordering Seoul. As a result, Yoon was persuaded to pay the deposit for an expensive apartment in Incheon, while he himself lived alone in a tiny semi-basement room near his workplace in Suwon. Semi-basement apartments in South Korea were never originally intended as homes. They were constructed as civil defense shelters in the event of war. However, the country's housing shortage eventually led the government to permit them to be rented as residential units. They are often associated with numerous problems. They can flood during the rainy season, are vulnerable to insects and rodents, and easily accumulate dust, dirt, and pollen. They tend to be cold in winter and damp in summer, while the small windows often cannot be left open because of rats. Perhaps most notoriously, many residents describe a persistent musty odor that can cling to clothing. Anyone who has seen the Academy Award-winning film Parasite may already have some idea of what life in one of these semi-basement apartments can be like. Despite these conditions, Yoon reportedly borrowed $100,000 to pay the security deposit on the luxury apartment for the newlyweds. The arrangement was supposed to be simple. During the week, Yoon would stay in his semi-basement room near work. On weekends, he would visit his wife in Incheon. Occasionally, she was also supposed to visit him during the week. According to the SBS investigation, however, that never happened. Lee never allowed Yoon into the apartment he was paying for. He did not even have a key. Likewise, Lee never visited his room in Suwon while he was alive. The only time she ever entered it was immediately after his funeral. Surveillance footage reportedly shows Lee arriving with Cho and removing every valuable item from the apartment. They never returned. Following Yoon's death, his family made another unexpected discovery. Lee had a daughter named Kim, whom Yoon had legally adopted. As a result, the girl became one of his legal heirs. This meant that assets such as benefits owed by Yoon's employer and the refundable security deposit on the apartment, a common feature of South Korea's rental system, would pass to Kim. Had Yoon not adopted the child, those assets would have been divided between his wife and his parents. Because Kim was now a legal heir, however, the money would effectively be controlled by her mother. Furthermore, Yoon's parents might ultimately become responsible for caring for Kim, and, depending on future legal circumstances, she could potentially have inheritance rights involving their estate as well. After learning all of this, Yoon's family was devastated. They petitioned the court to annul Kim's adoption. However, before rushing to judge Yoon's parents for making such a request, it is important to understand that they believed they had compelling reasons for doing so. After SBS aired its investigative episode, the police were forced to reopen the case. Initially, investigators had concluded that Yoon's death was a tragic accident. Since he had jumped voluntarily and no one had pushed him from the cliff, there appeared to be no evidence of foul play. Moreover, Lee, Cho, and Kwon all told police the same story. They theorized that Yoon's foot had become trapped between rocks immediately after entering the water, preventing him from resurfacing. Later, however, a forensic pathologist made a significant discovery. Foam was found in Yoon's lungs. According to forensic experts, this type of foam forms when water and air repeatedly pass through the airways during the struggle to breathe. In other words, Yoon had fought for his life before he died. He had surfaced for air, gone back underwater, surfaced again, and repeated the cycle several times. If that conclusion was correct, then Lee, Cho, and Kwon had not told the truth. Even accepting Choi's account, that Yoon surfaced after the jump and initially appeared to be fine, did not necessarily prove that anyone had pushed him from the cliff. It remained possible that he had suffered a cramp in the cold water. What it did not explain was Cho's behavior. Why did he swim toward Yoon so slowly? Why didn't he throw him the inflatable tube? Following these discoveries, Lee, Cho, and Kwon became criminal suspects, and investigators began examining their pasts. Had the police conducted a more thorough investigation from the beginning, they might have been astonished by what they eventually uncovered. The first time Lee attracted national attention, she was only 13 years old. She appeared on a television program in which a team of specialists renovated the homes of struggling families, improving both the design and living conditions. Lee came from an extremely poor household. Both of her parents were disabled, relied on wheelchairs, were unable to work, and survived on modest government assistance. Much of the household responsibility fell on Lee. Viewers admired her humility, diligence, and apparent devotion to her parents. During the program, the host asked her what she would wish for if she could have one wish. The question carried no promise that the wish would actually be granted, so she could have asked for anything. Instead, Lee answered that she wished she had her own room because she was a restless sleeper. She tossed and turned, talked in her sleep, and worried that she kept her parents awake. To many viewers, it sounded like an unusually thoughtful and selfless answer for a 13-year-old. She wasn't asking for a room simply for herself. She wanted her parents to be able to sleep peacefully. Lee also said that when she grew up, she hoped to earn enough money to help people who were struggling in life. How did that seemingly kind-hearted child later become a suspect in her husband's death? After details of Lee's later life became public, numerous psychologists and commentators argued online that she had never truly been as self-sacrificing as she appeared on television. Instead, they suggested she had always known exactly what people wanted to hear. 2 years after appearing on the home renovation show, at the age of 15, Lee ran away from home. She dropped out of school and stopped caring for her parents. Instead, she began spending time with older boys who bought her gifts. According to later reports, those relationships gradually became her primary source of income. She eventually entered the sex trade, while Cho, who was 1 year younger than she was, reportedly acted as something resembling her pimp. At 18, Lee unexpectedly returned to her parents' home carrying an infant. She left the baby with them and walked away again. How her disabled parents were expected to raise their granddaughter without adequate financial resources appeared to be of little concern to her. Lee reportedly said that she herself could not afford to support the child financially. Critics, however, pointed out that during this period she was apparently able to spend money on cosmetic surgery, arguing that the issue may have been one of priorities rather than financial inability. She married for the first time in 2010, when she was 19 years old. Her daughter, Kim, was born the following year. Despite the timing, it has never been conclusively established that Lee's first husband was Kim's biological father, as investigators later alleged that Lee had been involved in multiple relationships simultaneously. One reason for that conclusion is that, also in 2010, one of Lee's boyfriends died in a traffic accident. In other words, sometime between her first marriage and the birth of her daughter, she was involved with another man. Little information about that crash has been made public. Lee and her boyfriend were riding in a car when another vehicle struck them. The driver fled the scene. Because the collision occurred on the passenger side, Lee's boyfriend was killed, while Lee survived. She later received an insurance payout. Police never attempted to prove that Lee had orchestrated the accident, and it is entirely possible that she bore no responsibility for what happened. Nevertheless, some later commentators argued that the incident may have shown her how police investigations and insurance claims typically unfolded after fatal accidents. Far more is known about another relationship that also ended in death. Lee later became engaged to another young man and reportedly hoped to marry him. However, because he was still young, he was required to complete South Korea's mandatory military service. Before he enlisted, Lee persuaded him to take one last vacation with her, a kind of honeymoon before the wedding. He paid for the trip. Together they flew to Pattaya. Only Lee returned home. On July 16, 2014, her fiancé died in Thailand. According to Lee's initial account, the couple had been snorkeling to see the coral reefs when he suddenly lost consciousness and died. After returning to South Korea, however, the man's relatives and friends asked her to explain exactly what had happened. This time, Lee reportedly gave a different version of events. She said they had been drinking, gone swimming at night, and that he had been swept away by the waves. The story bore certain similarities to the circumstances surrounding the later death of her husband, Yoon. The fiancé's older brother never believed her explanation and suspected Lee of being responsible for his brother's death. Those suspicions, however, led nowhere. The insurance money was paid to his family rather than to Lee, and, according to publicly available information, she did not receive any financial benefit from his death. Thai authorities quickly ruled the incident an accidental drowning. Some later investigators and commentators would speculate that this case taught Lee an important lesson. If financial gain had been the motive, a legal marriage would need to come before a fatal accident. It should be noted, however, that this interpretation reflects allegations made during the later investigation rather than a judicial finding of fact. The second time Lee attempted to marry was in November 2015, and the circumstances were even more unusual. She became engaged to yet another boyfriend who was deeply in love with her and eager to marry as soon as possible, despite repeated warnings from his friends to slow down. They felt there was something strange about Lee. No one knew much about her background. None of them had ever met her family or longtime friends. The groom dismissed their concerns. The couple began planning a lavish wedding. During the rehearsal, the groom met Lee's relatives and friends for the first time, and immediately noticed that something seemed off. Some of the guests arrived wearing t-shirts and jeans, attire considered highly inappropriate for a traditional Korean wedding. There were other oddities as well. Lee's parents appeared to know almost nothing about her life, while her supposed friends seemed strangely indifferent toward her. Growing suspicious, the groom's parents hired a private investigator. According to later reports, the investigator quickly discovered that every guest attending on the bride's side had been hired as a paid actor. When Lee realized her deception had been exposed, she abandoned the wedding before the ceremony was completed. The failed groom reportedly developed severe depression and anxiety afterward, leaving him afraid to trust or become close to other people. It was not the last time he saw Lee. She later reappeared and claimed that little Kim was his daughter. The man had once been deeply in love with Lee, but not enough to forget basic arithmetic. The dates simply made her claim impossible. Lee disappeared from his life for good. His family subsequently had the marriage annulled. Yet even an annulled wedding could still prove profitable. In South Korea, weddings often include large guest lists, and attendees commonly give cash gifts to the newlyweds. Those gifts frequently cover much of the wedding's cost, and sometimes provide the couple with additional savings. According to reports, one of Lee's weddings brought in approximately $10,000 in cash gifts alone. In May 2016, Lee attempted to marry for a third time. This time, she convinced one of her former boyfriends that little Kim was his biological daughter. She persuaded him that they should marry for the child's sake. The ceremony was held in what appeared, judging from photographs, to be a fast food restaurant or casual cafe. Despite the modest venue, the couple reportedly hired a well-known singer to entertain the guests, a practice that is not uncommon at Korean weddings. Then, during the ceremony, the groom received a phone call from a friend. The caller claimed that Lee was actually his girlfriend and that they were living together. Shocked, the groom and his family confronted Lee in front of the guests. Humiliated, she fled before the wedding ceremony had ended. That autumn, in 2016, Lee finally married Yoon in Las Vegas. After the wedding, the newlyweds signed the lease for an expensive apartment. Soon afterward, Lee attempted to purchase life insurance, naming herself as the beneficiary. However, the application was reportedly rejected because the marriage had not yet been legally registered in South Korea. As a result, the couple legally registered their marriage in Korea in March 2017. Lee then contacted an insurance agent she already knew, reportedly yet another former boyfriend. With his assistance, she purchased 4 life insurance policies covering Yoon, with a combined payout of roughly $800,000 at the time, approximately $600,000 in today's dollars according to some estimates. The monthly premiums totaled about $700. Maintaining all 4 policies was expensive, and Lee allegedly allowed them to lapse on multiple occasions before reinstating them. Then came another remarkable coincidence. Yoon died only 4 hours before the policies were due to expire. Investigators later concluded that Lee had known exactly when the coverage would end. She had reportedly received a notice warning that if the next premium was not paid before the end of that day, all 4 policies would be canceled. In other words, according to prosecutors, Yoon died while the insurance coverage was still in force. Investigators also questioned why Lee had repeatedly canceled and reinstated the policies. Their theory was that the trip to the Gapyeong River Valley was not the first attempt on Yoon's life. According to prosecutors, the earliest known attempt may have occurred in June 2018, when Lee allegedly punctured one of Yoon's car tires. Yoon noticed the problem before driving far and simply took the vehicle to a repair shop. The second alleged attempt was far more elaborate. One of Japan's most famous delicacies is pufferfish, or fugu. Certain species contain tetrodotoxin, an extremely potent poison capable of causing fatal paralysis if improperly prepared. For this reason, licensed chefs undergo extensive training before they are legally permitted to serve the dish. There is no specific antidote for tetrodotoxin poisoning. Treatment is largely supportive while the toxin clears from the body. On February 25, 2019, several months before Yoon's death, Lee reportedly took him to eat fugu. Prosecutors later alleged that she had somehow obtained pufferfish toxin, possibly through criminal contacts associated with Cho, although the precise source was never publicly established. According to the prosecution, Lee secretly added the toxin to Yoon's food. He became seriously ill, but survived. Investigators later recovered a message allegedly sent by Lee to Cho expressing frustration that the poisoning had failed. The reported message read, "I put so much poison in his food. Why isn't he dead yet?" Prosecutors further alleged that, after this failed poisoning, Lee turned to another method: water. Knowing that Yoon could not swim, she allegedly made repeated attempts to place him in dangerous situations around deep water. According to investigators, she pressured him into riding inflatable water tubes and, on at least one occasion, personally pushed him into the water. Then, in May 2019, about 1 month before Yoon's death, the group went on a fishing trip. They were not fishing from the shore or from a boat, but from a floating fishing platform, a type of cabin built on the water. After dark, prosecutors alleged Lee pushed Yoon into the lake. This attempt also failed. She had apparently misjudged the depth of the water. Instead of falling into deep water, Yoon simply stood up. The water only reached his waist. One obvious question remains. Didn't Yoon realize that his wife had pushed him? According to the account presented by prosecutors, he almost certainly did. Yet by that point, investigators believed he had become so psychologically accustomed to Lee's behavior that he no longer resisted whatever she said or did. Yoon and Lee met approximately 4 years before they married. Yoon told his family that he had met his future wife through work. However, Lee had never worked for the same company, or even in the same industry. Given what investigators later uncovered about Lee's background, some have speculated that the two may have met under different circumstances that Yoon felt uncomfortable discussing with his family. Whatever the case, Prosecutors believe that Lee had a clear reason for taking an interest in him. Yoon worked as a research scientist in the laboratory of a major corporation and earned between $60,000 and $70,000 per year at a time when the average annual salary in South Korea was roughly $35,000. He was also exceptionally frugal. By the time he met Lee, he had reportedly saved more than $300,000. Yoon's friends knew how much he earned and were well aware of his substantial savings. That is why they were puzzled when, not long after the wedding, Yoon began asking to borrow the equivalent of only a few dollars, just enough to buy a package of instant ramen and a bottle of water from a nearby convenience store. Eventually, they learned why. According to investigators, every time Yoon received his paycheck, the entire amount was immediately transferred to Lee. The money remained in his account for only seconds before disappearing into hers. Lee controlled all of the family's finances. Yoon's friends became increasingly concerned. They tried to explain that this was not normal. He should have had access to his own money, even if Lee had convinced him that, traditionally, a wife managed the household finances after marriage. They reminded him that modern South Korea no longer followed that custom in the same way. More importantly, they argued, even in families that did follow the tradition, it had never meant that the husband should go hungry while the wife spent freely on designer goods and vacations. When Yoon asked to borrow $3, his friends often sent him much more, perhaps $100. Yoon would quietly return $97. That was simply the kind of person he was. According to those who knew him, he spent the last 2 years of his life living on almost nothing. During the work week, he could at least eat in the company cafeteria. Weekends were far more difficult. He lost a significant amount of weight and often appeared exhausted and malnourished. Lee knew about his condition. According to prosecutors, she showed little concern. Sometimes Yoon would send her photographs of his worn-out shoes or broken eyeglasses, asking if she could buy him a new pair of sneakers because his old ones had fallen apart, and he felt embarrassed wearing them to work. She refused. Investigators alleged that Lee spent his savings, consumed his entire salary, and continually demanded even more, pressuring him to take out loans. Over 5 years, Yoon went from being one of the more financially secure people in his social circle to someone overwhelmed by debt. At first, Lee reportedly offered explanations for why she needed such large amounts of money. She claimed she was caring for her elderly parents. On another occasion, she allegedly told Yoon she had tried to launch an online gambling website, illegal in South Korea, and that she had been cheated and now owed money. Eventually, according to investigators, she stopped offering explanations altogether. She simply demanded everything he earned. She also monitored his spending and required him to ask permission before using his own money, even to pay his rent. In 2018, Yoon filed for personal bankruptcy. By then, his debts reportedly totaled around $120,000. According to prosecutors, Lee remained unmoved. Instead, she continued demanding more. At one point, she allegedly instructed Yoon to hand over his older sister's credit card, which he happened to have with him. The card quickly ended up in Cho's possession. Lee and Cho then went to a gas station and charged more than $5,000 to the card. That amount far exceeded any realistic fuel purchase. Investigators alleged that the transaction was actually a method of converting credit into cash, with the cooperation of the station's owner, who was believed to be another acquaintance of Cho's and allegedly kept a commission for facilitating the scheme. It would be inaccurate, however, to say that Lee never sent Yoon any money. On one occasion, she transferred him approximately $30. The money disappeared almost immediately. An automatic payment for the use of a vehicle was processed the moment it reached his account. According to investigators, the vehicle was driven not by Yoon or even by Lee, but by Cho. As a result, the money existed in Yoon's account only for a matter of seconds before vanishing again. When Yoon decided to get married, he almost certainly imagined a very different life. He could never have expected that his wife would spend his money while maintaining relationships with other men, or that she would speak to him with contempt. Ironically, many details of their relationship became known because Yoon frequently recorded their conversations. The reasons remain unclear. Perhaps he hoped to preserve evidence. Perhaps he wanted to understand their arguments afterward. Or perhaps he simply felt so isolated that he found himself replaying his wife's voice despite the way she treated him. Early in the relationship, Yoon seems to have viewed Lee as the kind-hearted 13-year-old girl he had seen on television, a child who had been forced to grow up too quickly. He appears to have understood her desire to spend money on herself, to travel, and to enjoy the things she had lacked during childhood. He excused her extravagant spending. Perhaps he believed he could help her heal. He saw goodness in her because he himself was, by all accounts, a generous and compassionate man. According to the prosecution's case, only once did Yoon seriously attempt to leave her. That happened after Lee allegedly assaulted him physically. Even then, she persuaded him to stay. She reportedly told him that she never intentionally hurt the people closest to her, that it simply happened. Then she warned him that he would never be able to get away from her anyway. According to investigators, these cycles of cruelty, remorse, assurance, and intimidation became a defining pattern in Lee's relationships. According to the prosecution, the emotional manipulation in Yoon's marriage became so severe that he eventually saw no way out. Prosecutors argued that Lee gradually conditioned him to accept increasingly irrational demands. They alleged that she repeatedly distorted reality, tested his willingness to accept her version of events, and exploited his desire to care for others above himself. In their view, the process was gradual. Each new demand became slightly more extreme than the last. Each compromise made the next one easier. Over time, prosecutors argued, Yoon became trapped in a reality defined by Lee rather than by his own judgment. Eventually, investigators discovered internet searches that painted a heartbreaking picture of his state of mind. According to evidence presented in court, Yoon searched online for information about selling what is colloquially known in Korean slang as a ghost helicopter, a term referring to human organs and tissues such as kidneys, the liver, the heart, the corneas, tendons, the pancreas, and other transplantable body parts. Prosecutors argued that Yoon hoped to sell his organs to earn additional money for Lee. He had already exhausted his savings. He had taken out loans. From the prosecution's perspective, he believed his own body was the only valuable thing he still possessed. The evidence suggested that he intended to leave Lee with as much money as possible, even after his own death. According to prosecutors, he never had the chance. Before he could act on those plans, Lee allegedly carried out her own. Once investigators began uncovering these details, Lee and Cho reportedly learned that the police were closing in. They disappeared. In early 2022, the pair were placed on Interpol's wanted list. Investigators initially feared they had fled overseas, particularly because Cho was believed to have connections to organized crime. 3 months later, however, detectives received an unexpected tip. Lee and Cho had not left the country at all. They had simply relocated to another city, where they were reportedly spotted socializing with friends. Police arrested both of them. Following their arrests, investigators also detained Kwon, the third man who had been present during Yoon's fatal jump, and charged him with participating in the crime. The prosecution's primary focus, however, remained Lee and Cho. According to investigators, Lee had never intended to evade justice forever. Instead, prosecutors argued that she planned to remain in hiding only long enough to accumulate approximately $300,000, which she hoped to use to hire one of South Korea's most prestigious law firms. During the investigation, prosecutors alleged that Lee had continued working as a high-end escort whose clientele included wealthy and influential individuals. They argued that these experiences had convinced her that almost any legal problem could be overcome with enough money or the right connections. She reportedly believed that if she could secure the country's best attorneys, she would ultimately escape conviction. That plan never materialized. According to prosecutors, Lee excelled at spending money, not saving it. The trial unfolded very differently from what she had hoped. The court heard testimony describing how Yoon had reportedly lived during the final years of his life. Witnesses spoke of a man who was frequently hungry, who wore broken eyeglasses and torn shoes because he could not afford replacements, despite earning a respectable salary. The court also heard allegations regarding the abuse he endured. Prosecutors presented evidence relating to the watermelon incident, the alleged poisoning attempt involving pufferfish toxin, and several alleged attempts to stage fatal accidents involving water. Although psychological manipulation and emotional abuse are often difficult to prove in court, Prosecutors argued that the cumulative evidence demonstrated a clear pattern of coercive control. The court ultimately found both Lee and Cho guilty. Lee received a sentence of life imprisonment. Cho was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Even after her conviction, however, Lee continued to attract attention. According to reports, she began corresponding with Cho Ju-bin, the notorious criminal convicted in South Korea for operating a large-scale online sexual blackmail network. After learning of Lee's sentence, Cho reportedly wrote to her in prison, and the two began exchanging letters. Looking back, there is a striking irony to the entire case. According to prosecutors, Lee and Cho might never have become suspects had they not voluntarily approached South Korea's largest television network in an effort to pressure an insurance company into paying Yoon's life insurance. Instead, the publicity prompted journalists to investigate, which in turn led police to reopen the case. What had initially been ruled a tragic accident ultimately became one of South Korea's most widely publicized homicide investigations. According to the prosecution's case, Lee viewed people as instruments to be used rather than individuals to be loved. They argued that she exploited Yoon's compassion to control him, relied on his devotion to keep him close, and ultimately sought to profit from his death. The court accepted that theory, concluding that the evidence established her guilt beyond a reasonable doubt.
Room 113 in the dormitory of the prestigious Jian School was shared by several girls. All of them were 17, in their final year, and top of their class. The pressure was unreal, studying around the clock, no distractions, only books and discipline. But the girls were close friends. They shared news, joys, and sorrows. That's why what happened one winter night in the middle of the school year came as such a shock. By morning, only one of them was still alive, and her story is stranger than fiction. At the center of this story is Jian School, but this was no ordinary school. Proudly located in Tianjin, China, it had the reputation of being one of the top academic institutions in the country, if not the very best. Students fortunate enough to pass through its gates were destined for the nation's most prestigious universities. But prestige came at a price. All students were required to live on campus, regardless of how close their homes were to the school. Boys and girls lived in separate dormitories, each governed by strict rules and under constant video surveillance. Leaving the dorms was only permitted with written approval from both a teacher and dorm administration. The winter morning of December 23, 1998, at Jian School's dormitory began like any other. The girls were climbing out of their warm beds and hurrying to wash up and prepare for class. But something was preventing the girls from room 112 from getting ready, a strange smell. They stepped into the hallway trying to find the source and realized the odor was seeping from under the door of room 113, their neighboring room. While the others hesitated, unsure of what to do, one girl stepped forward and gently knocked on the door. When there was no response, she gave it a slight push. The door opened easily. The moment the door swung open, the girl was nearly knocked off her feet by a strong, sharp, and overwhelmingly foul odor. Then she saw the bodies. Some of the girls were lying in their beds, others sprawled on the floor, their hair splayed out, arms and legs twisted into the most unnatural positions. It looked like a scene straight out of hell. One girl was curled up in the fetal position. Others lay as if they had collapsed mid-step. What the students saw was blood, urine, vomit, dried foam at the corners of mouths, broken fingernails, and scratch marks on the floor. She screamed in terror. Her friends came running. Some fainted on the spot. Others fled in horror. The dormitory supervisor, hearing the commotion upstairs, arrived and saw the same horrifying scene. Fighting back nausea with all her strength, she called the police. Police officers and medics rushed to the scene. The ambulance arrived quickly, but all the victims had been dead for some time. There was nothing anyone could do. Even though emergency personnel had been informed about the nature of the call, they were still shocked by the horrific scene that awaited them in room 113. There were 7 of them, 7 17-year-old girls, roommates. Some of the unfortunate students were lying on their backs, faces twisted in grimaces, their unseeing eyes staring toward the door. Foam covered the mouths of several girls. One girl, lying on her bed, was clutching a doll so tightly that her fingernails had left deep imprints in it. Forensic examiners couldn't even pry her fingers away. Another girl had clearly tried to crawl across the floor. She had scratched at it so violently that her nails had been torn off, leaving raw flesh and blood behind. Under some of the girls, the floor was soiled with excrement as they had lost control of their bodily functions in death, adding an even more unbearable odor to the room. But the most disturbing part was their eyes. All of their pupils had shrunk to the size of pinpricks. Aside from the bodies, police found fruit in the room, as well as a small knife, presumably used to cut the fruit. There were also cups with a bit of water left in them. The police sent the bodies and the evidence for analysis, determined to find out exactly how the schoolgirls had died. While police officers continued their investigation, they interviewed other students and dormitory staff. That's when they learned that the strange smell had actually appeared the night before. On the evening of December 22nd, around midnight as the girls were getting ready for bed, some of them noticed an odd odor. It didn't resemble the usual smells of a dormitory. It was sharp and chemical. At the time, they couldn't determine its exact source, so they turned to the dorm supervisor. The supervisor also noticed the smell, especially near rooms 113, 112, 111, and 110. But since it was already late, she decided not to disturb the girls in those rooms. Instead, she tried to contact the school administration, but no one answered the phone. So she walked the girls over to the teacher's building, hoping to find someone on duty or to reach their homeroom teacher. That attempt also failed. By the time they returned, it was past 1 a.m. Not wanting the girls to oversleep and miss classes the next day, the supervisor advised them to go to bed. She planned to look into the matter in the morning. Everyone dispersed. And yet, if only they had insisted on opening those few rooms that night, maybe the victims would have had a chance to survive. Surely both the students and the supervisor blamed themselves for not making that decision. But how could they have known? Who would ever expect something like this to happen in a school dormitory? After speaking with the dorm supervisor, the police noticed another detail. Most of the rooms in the dormitory housed 8 students, including room 113. But there were only 7 bodies in the room. Where was the 8th girl? Had she somehow escaped the tragedy? Or had she been taken by the perpetrator? No one knew. The police immediately shifted their focus to searching for the missing student. Imagine their astonishment when she appeared on her own. The girl's name was San. After the investigation had already begun, one of her classmates ran into her at the school sports field. While police were searching high and low for her, she had been freely moving around the school. Officers quickly approached San and asked where she had been the previous night. Had she gone anywhere? San innocently replied that she hadn't gone anywhere and had simply slept peacefully in the room. But if she had truly been in that room, she must have known how her roommates died, and yet she insisted she had no idea. The situation grew surreal. Police couldn't believe that she had spent the night in a room where 7 girls died and supposedly knew nothing about it. They spoke with her for a long time, trying to get the truth, but she stubbornly stuck to her story. Finally, the results from the laboratory arrived. They confirmed what investigators had suspected. The girls had been poisoned. However, no one could have imagined what they were poisoned with. The cause of death was organophosphate poisoning, specifically parathion. Parathion, also known as thiophos, is an organophosphate compound, a powerful insecticide that is extremely toxic to humans. It primarily affects the nervous system. The lethal dose is just 2 milligrams. The poison starts to act within 10 minutes, leading to the failure of the muscles involved in breathing, and a deadly amount of fluid builds up in the lungs. Specialists found the pesticide in the victims' digestive systems and vomit, as well as in the cups located at the crime scene. This meant that all 7 girls had ingested the poison in the dormitory. But how could such a toxic pesticide end up in a school dorm? The food in the cafeteria was tested. No toxic substances were found, and access to the cafeteria was restricted to school personnel, so the poisoner couldn't have come from outside. Surveillance footage and school staff also confirmed that no strangers had entered the building that night. That meant the poison could only have been added by someone already inside. And yet, only the girls from room 113 were affected. All the other students in the school were perfectly fine. For understandable reasons, San, who lived in the same room, became the main suspect. Police took her fingerprints and compared them to those found on the cups. Her prints were indeed on all the cups at the crime scene, as well as on the small knife used for cutting fruit. But that alone didn't prove anything. After all, she lived in that room. However, another group of officers managed to uncover a crucial lead. They traced the source of the parathion to a store that sold it. The shopkeeper clearly remembered the buyer. It's not every day that a high school girl purchases a dangerous chemical. The store employee reported that a half-kilogram of parathion was bought by a high school student. When the police asked him to identify the customer, he immediately pointed to San. All the collected evidence pointed directly at her. But there was one thing the police couldn't understand. Even in diluted form, parathion has an extremely strong and pungent odor. It's nearly impossible not to notice. Moreover, its toxicity spreads quickly, causing severe pain. If even one girl had ingested the poison a bit earlier than the others, the rest would have noticed immediately, and they would have had time to call for help. The poisoner had to not only make sure all the girls took the poison at the same time, but also prevent anyone nearby from hearing their cries for help. If San was the killer, how did she manage to solve both of these problems? One frail girl against 7. How did she stop them from calling for help? How did she convince them to drink the poison? The police began to suspect that perhaps the immense pressure on the students or some external influence had led the girls to take the poison collectively. But their teachers and classmates insisted that the girls had been cheerful, high-achieving, and had bright futures ahead. There was no way they would do something like that. At the same time, investigators had already confirmed that no one heard sounds of struggle or cries for help that night. It became clear. To get to the truth, they would have to convince San to tell them what really happened. The investigators listed all the evidence they had gathered so far. Tension in the interrogation room was rising. Even though San initially appeared calm and composed, even capable of withstanding intense psychological pressure, she was still just a 17-year-old girl. And finally, the quiet, collected student broke down. She covered her face with her hands, started crying, and began to speak. But the truth she told the police had nothing to do with what they had expected. San admitted that she had indeed purchased the insecticide, but she insisted she did not kill her roommates. Lou did, she said. The name Lou was familiar to the police. She was one of the 7 victims found in room 113. Her cause of death was identical to the others. Could someone be both the killer and a victim at the same time? The police still had serious doubts about San's story, but San said that everything that happened in room 113 was part of a plan by her best friend Lou. Even in such a prestigious school, where classes were always a priority because everything was aimed at excellent exam results and admission to the best universities in China, teenagers remained teenagers. Lou's thoughts hadn't been about lessons for several months. In September 1997, Lou started dating a boy. Such romantic relationships were not approved at school, but that didn't stop the young people. From the day Lou entered the world of romance, it seemed that only her boyfriend existed for her. However, teenage love often turns out to be short-lived. Less than a year passed before the boy broke up with Lou. For her, this news was like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. She tried to save the relationship, but was met with an even harsher rejection from her boyfriend. Of course, Lou shared her feelings with her best friend San, but even sharing her pain with her friend didn't make it go away. She couldn't cope and reached the breaking point where she thought about death. The girl asked San to buy pesticides for her. Most people would never agree to fulfill such a request. So San refused her friend, but Lou insisted, wouldn't leave San alone, constantly describing her suffering after losing her boyfriend. San fell under the influence of Lou's love-blinded mind and reluctantly agreed. The girl seized a moment when she could leave the school, found a store that sold pesticides, and bought a bottle of parathion. Lou, having obtained the pesticide, suddenly seemed to calm down. She told her friend that she would drink it that very evening, putting an end to the pain caused by her lost love. However, after all the girls in the room had finished their homework and were getting ready to go to bed, Lou unexpectedly changed her mind. No, she didn't change her mind about drinking the parathion, but she turned to San with an even more absurd request. The girl said that going to another world alone was too lonely. Therefore, she decided that all the roommates would go with her. "You're my best friend. Can you help me one more time?" She shocked San with an even wilder request. This request went beyond all bounds. What had the other girls done besides being unlucky enough to be Lou's roommates? Why should they share her choice? Incredible as it was, San agreed. That very evening, they began to carry out the plan. Lou personally mixed the insecticide with honey and fruit juice to slightly mask its bitter taste and poured a cup for each roommate, except for San. She told her friends that it was medicine her mother had prepared and sent to prevent tuberculosis, which was currently raging in the city. Several cases of the disease had already been registered at school, and 6 students had to go home, missing classes. which could ruin their chances of getting into university. Therefore, all the other students were very afraid of getting sick. When Lu said that her mother, a doctor, had made the medicine for everyone, the girls believed her, willingly took their cups, and even thanked Lu. However, the medicine had a strange smell. The girls couldn't hide their disgust. But Lu waved off their complaints, explaining that all herbal medicines naturally have a strange odor. Saying this, she raised her cup and drank it all down. The other girls stopped grumbling and also drank the medicine, except for San. San explained that she had already drunk her portion at lunch. She watched as the 7 girls, including her best friend, drank the poisonous potion, believing that traditional Chinese medicine would protect them from tuberculosis. The girls didn't leave even a drop in their cups. After that, there was no turning back. The effect of the pesticide appeared very quickly. The process of organophosphate poisoning is incredibly painful. The schoolgirls couldn't bear the hellish pain and began to moan, but San reassured everyone that the pain was a normal reaction to the medicine. When she had taken it during the day, she too had felt discomfort like the others, but soon it passed. San stayed close to her friends, comforting them, urging them to stay calm and not disturb the other girls in the dormitory while sleeping. Incredibly, her words had a magical effect. 6 schoolgirls turned out to be truly kind-hearted people, and despite the terrible pain, they felt it was unacceptable to disturb the others' sleep, so they did not scream. San continued to play the role of the perfect friend. She gave the girls hot water and peeled apples for them, taking care of them as if they were sick. Looking at her at that moment, no one would have guessed that she was a devil watching her roommates die in agony without even raising an eyebrow. Meanwhile, the girls clung to various objects nearby, hoping to endure the pain as San had promised. But even after eating the fruit, their symptoms did not improve at all. On the contrary, the agony intensified. Perhaps they suspected something. But by that time, they no longer had the strength to scream. One girl fell from the bed and crawled across the room to the door, scratching the floor with her nails, trying to get out into the corridor and attract someone's attention. But she remained lying on the floor with torn nails, unable to move any further. The poor girl died with wide open eyes. The lives of the roommates gradually slipped away in a silent struggle. Losing the fight against the terrible poison, they left this world one by one. Sitting nearby, San simply watched what was happening. After all the roommates succumbed to the poison, San just lay down to sleep as if nothing had happened. Just imagine the scene. 7 girls frozen in horrifying poses in a tiny little room. The air was filled with the stench of excrement and vomit. Even thinking about it is enough to make your hair stand on end. Yet San calmly slept on her bed next to her 7 dead friends. When she woke up, she simply stepped over the bodies and went to her classes. The police were shocked by this story. When investigators asked why she didn't just refuse Liu, why she didn't leave when the girls drank the poison, San answered, "She was my best friend. I had to help her." And there was no trace of remorse in her voice. The investigators had no doubt that the girl's story was a hastily concocted lie. San was shifting the blame onto her dead friend, who could no longer defend herself. But an unexpected clue made the detectives reconsider, thinking that this wild story might actually be true. The police found a note from Liu hidden under her bed. They did not disclose the full contents of the note, but Liu explained the reason for her insane act, and it really was love, just as San had said. She also explained why she took all the roommates with her, except San. The note contained words like these: "My dear friend, keep living and enjoying life. I am upset and lack the courage to take you with me. Forgive me for not listening to your advice and for hurting you so much. Everything that happened today is my just punishment. Don't hate or be angry with me." After discovering the note, the police compared the handwriting and confirmed it was written by Liu. Now they had confirmation of San's story. Still, the actions of the surviving girl were beyond rational explanation. To help a friend like that and watch 6 people die, this was beyond any norms. Psychologists suggested that San might be a psychopath. She was simply incapable of empathy. Therefore, she could not truly understand Liu's suffering. Seeing the deaths of her roommates, she felt no fear or guilt. In any case, her criminal actions could not be denied. On December 24, 1998, San was charged. On July 28, 1999, the court delivered its verdict in this case. Taking into account Liu's note and the autopsy results, the court believed that San had purchased the pesticide at Liu's request and helped her commit the crime. Thus, the primary responsibility for the deaths of the 6 girls lay with Liu, while San's role was secondary. However, since her actions were no less shocking, she was sentenced to life imprisonment. The defendant was dissatisfied and tried to appeal the verdict, claiming that she only bought the pesticide and did not know it was poisonous. The judge immediately rejected this claim, stating that the school where the girl studied was known for its excellent education. As a senior student, she could not have been unaware that drinking pesticide could be deadly. San continued to file appeals, but all were denied. The families of the 6 deceased students demanded compensation. They requested 1.5 million Chinese yuan in total, 250,000 yuan for each family. However, the court ruled that each family would receive 1,000 yuan to cover funeral expenses and approximately 50,000 yuan as compensation for the death of their loved ones. Liu's family was ordered to pay 45% of the amount, San's family 30%, and the school would cover the remaining 25%. It seemed the verdict was clear, and the criminal would spend the rest of her life in prison where she belonged. However, thanks to her excellent behavior and the fact that San was a minor at the time of the crime, her sentence was reduced to 15 years. She was released in 2013. Afterwards, she changed her name and disappeared, became a ghost. The only person who knew what really happened that night vanished from sight. It is said she is married, has children, and lives a normal life. To this day, debates continue about whether San was the puppeteer or merely a puppet, controlled by Liu's dark resolve. But regardless of who planned the murder, who poured the poison into the cups on that fateful night, 6 innocent girls were denied the justice they deserved. Their names are engraved on gravestones as victims of murder, although they should have entered China's history for a very different reason. Could those girls have imagined that the medicine given by their friend's mother could be a deadly poison? But even more incredible is that someone would not want to die alone and would take all their roommates with them, and all because of a first school love.
On April 14, 2023, 2 friends, 32-year-old Siraporn Khanwang and 36-year-old Sararat Rangsaiwathaporn, commonly known as M, arrived at the Mekong riverbank in Ratchaburi, Thailand, to release fish into the river. This act of kindness, a virtuous deed, essentially constituted a traditional Buddhist ceremony. A surveillance camera captured Siraporn as she walked along the riverside pier, carrying the fish. She appeared lively and perfectly healthy. However, just moments later, Siraporn collapsed and passed away. Bystanders attempted to help her, but it was already too late. The sudden loss of her daughter during a routine outing with a friend shocked Siraporn's mother. She shared her suspicions with the police because her daughter had recently become friends with M. Furthermore, she was troubled by the disappearance of her daughter's belongings, an expensive handbag, around 40,000 baht in cash, a little over $1,000, and 2 mobile phones. The police initiated an investigation and attempted to gather details from M about the incident. Surprisingly, M claimed that she wasn't with her friend during the river incident. However, surveillance footage painted a different picture. When bystanders tried to save Siraporn's life, her friend fled in the opposite direction. Only after irrefutable evidence was presented, did M admit that she was at the river during the Buddhist ceremony. Forensic experts examined Siraporn's blood and stomach contents, confirming investigators and the deceased's family's suspicions by detecting traces of cyanide in her kidneys. M was arrested on April 25, and during a search of her house, a bottle of cyanide was found. When news of Siraporn's suspicious death reached the media, several other families contacted the police, suddenly realizing that their loved ones had also died after last being seen in M's company. M was a graduate of Nakhon Pathom Rajabat University, located slightly west of Bangkok. During her time there, she didn't stand out, and her professors cannot recall anything unusual about her appearance or behavior. She obtained her diploma in 2009 and became a specialist in the field of public relations. From 2012 to 2022, over the course of 10 years, she worked as a representative for at least 3 leading insurance agencies in the Thai market. Investigators were relieved to find out that there were no insurance claims made for any of the 12 policies M had sold. M was married to a police officer named Witoon Rangsaitwathaporn, with whom she lived until 2022. During this time, Witoon rose to the rank of a lieutenant colonel, and the couple had 2 children. They lived in an apartment provided by the police force, where their neighbors were fellow police officers. Neighbors remember M as reserved and only interacting with well-off police families. In 2022, the couple separated, fairly amicably, as they continued to live together for some time afterward. However, by the end of 2022, M started seeing a 35-year-old man named Sutizak Poonquan. The two were expecting a child, as M was 4 months pregnant. Unfortunately, on March 12, 2023, her boyfriend unexpectedly passed away, leading the police to now believe that he too fell victim to poisoning. After having dinner, Sutizak suddenly lost consciousness at a gas station. He was taken to the hospital, discharged, but unfortunately passed away the next day. Later, it became known to investigators that M had called her ex-husband, who came to her from Bangkok to Udon Thani. The former spouses got into Sutizak's car and without much hesitation, they went to apply for a loan, using the car as collateral. After that, they attempted to visit people to whom Sutizak had lent money, and tried to collect all these debts. In reality, M wanted to gain much more after her boyfriend's death. A representative from the insurance company contacted the police and shared that M had wanted to insure the man's life for 7 million baht or $200,000, but the regular insurance premium would have been 1,000 baht or $28, and she decided against pursuing this idea. With each new piece of information about M, investigators grew more horrified. 15 friends, aged 33 to 45, who had previously never complained about their health, suddenly fell ill after spending time with M. 14 of them passed away shortly after being in her company. This group even included 2 police officers. Police Major Nipa Sanjan passed away on April 1, 2023, due to respiratory and cardiac failure. She collapsed immediately after going with M to pray at Prapatam Cherdi in Nakhon Pathom. The police shared surveillance footage that captured the poisoning incident, and watching it is an emotional experience. Nipa was sitting on a bench when she suddenly became unwell. She curled up, hit her head, fell to the ground and lay motionless. What was her friend M doing at that moment? She was talking on the phone, with her hand resting on her side. At some point, she walked away from Nipa, completely ignoring her. She didn't even make an attempt to pretend to help. But was it worth expecting any semblance of care from her, considering she had already claimed 12 victims? Police Captain Kunda Torai didn't fare well after befriending M either. Kunda had just borrowed money from her friend before she was found lifeless in her car on August 10, 2022. There were no signs of trauma on her body. The car's dashcam, smartwatch, iPad, and mobile phone had all disappeared. The earliest murder linked to M dates back to 2015, involving the death of Montatip Kau In, known to everyone as Sai. M and Sai had been friends since childhood. While Sai wasn't exactly wealthy, she often lent various amounts of money to M. After marrying a foreigner, Sai moved to another country. However, in 2015, she returned to Thailand, and M picked her up from the airport in her car upon her arrival. Soon after, Sai passed away due to acute heart failure. Sai's mother remembers that M quickly intervened at the time, supposedly to handle her financial matters as per Sai's husband's request. Sai's family was shocked by her sudden death but believed it was fate. Yet, when news of M's accusations surfaced, they contacted the police, suspecting a connection, especially considering M had abruptly cut off all communication with Sai's family. As far as investigators know, after this incident, M refrained from committing crimes until 2020. However, from 2020 to 2023, 13 of her friends died. The symptoms they experienced were associated with cyanide poisoning. Some of them passed away after lending money to the suspect, while others had valuable items go missing. Kantima Pezard, who lent a substantial sum of money to M, believes that she could have been the 15th victim of the serial poisoner known as M. Cyanide, as dubbed by journalists. Cantimer had recently become friends with M. They went together to a large shopping center, but about a week before this, Cantimer lent M 250,000 baht, approximately $7,000. While shopping, Cantimer complained of a sore throat and feeling under the weather. M then gave her a cough medicine, likely of herbal origin. Cantimer took the medicine, got into her car, and started driving home when she suddenly felt a heaviness in her chest. She attempted to call M, but M ignored her call. Fortunately, Cantimer managed to reach the emergency medical hotline. By the time help arrived, she had stopped breathing, but medics were able to nearly bring her back to life. M never communicated with her again and didn't return the money. Now, of course, Cantimer is certain that she could have become one of M's victims if help hadn't arrived in time. She reported her story to the police. M. Cyanide's motive confirms the conclusions of a criminological study that suggests the motive of female serial killers is often driven by the desire for enrichment or gain from people close to them. In contrast, for male serial killers, the motive is usually tied to satisfying their intimate needs and preying on victims. M. Cyanide was addicted to gambling and had a desperate need to continue funding her addiction. She regularly visited gambling websites, and the police reported that somehow she lost nearly 1 million baht in a single day, which is approximately $28,000. Overall, the woman spent around 78 million baht on her addiction, over $2 million, which she obtained from her victims. Some of the money went toward paying off debts and obligations that M had accumulated due to her addiction, but not all of them were settled, and she continued to gamble with the rest. Law enforcement officers tried to identify the recipients of these funds and determine if any of these people were involved in the murders. While it's evident they weren't involved in the murders, the police are dismayed by the fact that online gambling websites continue to flourish in Thailand, generating significant profits for organized crime in the country and causing immense suffering for those who fall into their traps. The natural question arises: how did M convince her well-off acquaintances to give her money? After all, some of them had known her only recently, and it's unlikely that they would trust a new acquaintance so much. In reality, some people had known her since childhood, while others trusted her as a police officer's wife. Many of the victims were involved in financial schemes resembling pyramid schemes that M was part of. She would enter the lives of these affluent individuals, gaining their trust before various means of obtaining their money, including pyramid schemes, lottery fraud, shady investments, or simply borrowing money. Often, she would ask for small sums, and perhaps her well-off friends felt uncomfortable refusing her. Furthermore, in several cases, she managed to gain financial benefits even after poisoning her victims. For example, she assured the relatives of the deceased that she would handle all their affairs, gaining control. When victims inquired about getting their money back, she would invite them to lunch or on a trip and then introduce cyanide. Why didn't anyone notice that over a dozen acquaintances of M had died under suspicious circumstances? Because the poisoner operated in different provinces of the country, and until 2023, none of these cases were investigated. It's also important to note that the poisoner wasn't always in immediate proximity to the victims. For instance, Nimnakit, the wife of a doctor, passed away after ingesting a tablet sent to her by the poisoner via mail. The woman's husband believed his wife died due to constant fatigue and stress after giving birth to their little daughter. The poisoner had significant influence over Nim and dared to tell the young mother that she had gained weight during her pregnancy. She sent her a weight loss tablet. On November 23, just a month after giving birth, she sent another tablet, but it was dirty, and Nim couldn't take it. On the 25th of the same month, after taking the second tablet, Nim passed away. At that time, her husband wasn't at home, and her two children were left alone with their deceased mother until a neighbor came at the husband's request. Even though the woman's husband was a medical professional, he didn't suspect M and believe his wife had died of a heart condition they weren't aware of. A renowned forensic expert laments that Thailand lacks a coroner's office, which would be responsible for investigating sudden and suspicious deaths. In his opinion, if such a position existed, similar to those in the UK, Australia, and the US, M's crimes could have been uncovered sooner, and many lives could have been saved. Cyanide did not admit her guilt in the crimes, despite the efforts of the police. The lead investigator on the case explained that they only managed to get a partial admission from her regarding her involvement in the death of the latest victim, Siriporn. She made a vague statement suggesting that cyanide had been mixed with illicit substances, which the victim ingested. However, the investigator doesn't believe this story. The reason is quite simple: who would mix cyanide with prohibited substances, especially considering that cyanide is an extremely dangerous poison, and any dosage of it is associated with an immediate risk of death. Due to M's lack of confession, investigators were eager to identify the exact source of the cyanide and understand how she managed to easily access it over such a long period from 2015 to 2023. The cyanide used by the poisoner was the Spanish brand Pan Riac, which is imported to Thailand by one of the 15 Thai companies. The lead investigator believed that someone helped M purchase the poison. It was revealed that her sister owns a pharmacy, but investigators were particularly interested in individuals who bought the substance with the same batch number as the one found in M's house. Among the 100 buyers, Thai actress Ice was identified. Possession of cyanide without permission is illegal in Thailand, and all buyers were summoned for questioning. Ice admitted to purchasing cyanide online on April 25 for 3,000 baht. She claimed she intended to use it against snakes and monitor lizards that posed a threat to her dogs, and even provided a video as evidence. Ice's mother confirmed that the sealed bottle was still at their home and they would bring it to the police station for questioning. The police didn't press charges against Ice. Nevertheless, social media users criticized her, insinuating that she might become the next serial killer and referencing her manager's death 3 years ago, trying to link it to cyanide. This is likely more indicative of the current state of social media rather than any real suspicions about her. As for where M obtained the poison, the police haven't yet disclosed whether they've managed to uncover any information on that matter. After 3 months, the investigation into the horrific cases of cyanide poisonings came to an end. The chief investigator stated that the police had interviewed over 900 witnesses and examined 26,500 documents. He noted that this is a historic case for Thailand, where the suspect planned serial killings over an 8-year period, poisoning victims with cyanide. The symptoms of cyanide poisoning, which medical professionals often mistake for natural health issues, such as stroke or heart attack, prevented doubts from arising in the minds of the victims' relatives. Her main goal was to obtain funds from the victims and eliminate the debts that burdened her. M. Cyanide has been charged with approximately 80 counts, an unprecedented number in Thailand's history. In addition to attempted murder and intentional homicide of 14 individuals, she is accused of food and drug adulteration, theft, and document forgery. Her former lawyer, Thanicha Ichwanawat, and her ex-husband have been charged with aiding and abetting. Her ex-husband was dismissed from his job and arrested after his connection to forged documents and possession of stolen property, particularly victims' jewelry, was discovered. Despite this, he was released on bail and placed under electronic monitoring due to the lack of direct evidence linking him to the murders. Additionally, some leniency was shown towards him after expressing a willingness to meet his ex-wife in prison and convince her to confess to the poisonings. If she confesses to the crimes, she might expect some leniency from the court, otherwise, she could face the death penalty. When news of the charges against M emerged in April 2023, some families of the victims demanded the death penalty for her. However, some legal experts suggested that her life would likely be spared even if she is found guilty. This is due to the Criminal Procedure Code, which was amended in 2007, preventing the execution of a pregnant defendant. Although the death penalty can be postponed for 3 years, the punishment will automatically be commuted to life imprisonment if her child is alive after 3 years. Unfortunately, It later became known that M had lost her child, making her ineligible for this provision of the law. The police emphasized that the maximum punishment she faces is the death penalty. Currently, she is held in a women's prison in Bangkok and reportedly enjoys popularity among the inmates. The government has announced impending changes to the regulations for purchasing cyanide in Thailand. Importers will be required to provide detailed information about all buyers, whether individuals, businesses, or factories. Providing the reason for the purchase will be mandatory. If importers fail to provide this information to the police every 3 months, their licenses will be revoked. If M is found guilty of the numerous poisonings, her name will be added to the list of serial killers in Thailand over the past 100 years. Up until this point, the list had only included male names. The roster of infamous murderers who struck fear into the country's residents includes Boonpeng Heap Lek, also known as Iron Chest Boonpeng, publicly beheaded in 1919 for not only taking victims' lives but also placing bodies in boxes and throwing them into a canal. He killed between 2 and 7 people. Among recent criminals, Sumkid Pumpwang, known as Kid the Ripper, stands out. He was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of 5 masseuses in 2005. Chamlorn Nert Songtwan allegedly poisoned at least 8 truck drivers in 2011 to 2012 but died before being convicted. The list also features Si Ui, a convicted child killer who was executed in 1959, and the notorious adventurer Charles Sobrage, who managed to escape police custody in the 1970s after murdering 12 people. He earned nicknames like the Bikini Killer due to the attire of his victims and the Serpent for his skilled deception and ability to evade justice. He's the only one whose victim count compares to that of the one woman, who is likely to join this list, M. Cyanide.